Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Edward the Exile, the Anglo-Saxon prince who spent 40 years in foreign lands and returned home only to die mysteriously within days. His story bridges the final years of Anglo-Saxon England and the Norman conquest that would forever transform the kingdom. We'll softly explore his dramatic birth during England's darkest hour, his miraculous survival as a condemned infant, his long years as a stranger in Hungary, and his tragic homecoming, from his father's valiant battles against Danish invaders to his children's roles in shaping medieval Scotland and England's royal bloodline, all while the great powers of medieval Europe clashed for control of the English throne. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which part of Edward's story moves you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 11th century England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Edward, later known as Edward the Exile, entered this world in the year of our Lord 1016, and during what historians would later recognize as one of the most catastrophic periods in the long history of England. His birth occurred not in a time of peace and celebration, but in an era when the very foundations of the English kingdom trembled beneath the weight of invasion, when ancient royal bloodlines faced extinction, and when the future of an entire people hung precariously in the balance. The England of 1016 was a realm transformed beyond recognition from the prosperous kingdom it had been just decades earlier. Where once there had been order, there was now chaos. Where once there had been peace, there was now constant warfare. Where once there had been hope, there was now desperation. The kingdom that Edward's great-great-great-grandfather, Alfred the Great, had so carefully built, defended, and nurtured was being torn apart by forces both external and internal, and the infant prince's arrival came at the moment when that destruction reached its terrible climax. To truly understand the world into which Edward was born, we must journey backward through time, retracing the steps that led England to this dark hour. We must understand the failures of leadership, the strategic mistakes, and the personal weaknesses that allowed a once mighty kingdom to fall into the hands of foreign conquerors. Only by understanding the depth of the catastrophe can we appreciate the miraculous nature of Edward's survival and the tragedy of his ultimate fate. The story truly begins, not with Edward, but with his grandfather, the king whose reign would come to symbolize everything that could go wrong when a ruler lacked the strength, wisdom, eyes and courage that kingship demanded. King Ethelred II ascended to the English throne in the year 978, following the mysterious and violent death of his half-brother, King Edward the Martyr. The circumstances of Edward the Martyr's death were deeply suspicious. The young king had been murdered at Corfe Castle in Dorset, stabbed to death by unknown assailants while visiting his stepmother Elfrith and his half-brother Ethelred. Though no direct evidence implicated Elfrith or young Ethelred in the murder, rumours swirled that the boy's mother had orchestrated the killing to place her own son on the throne. Whether or not these rumours were true, Ethelred's reign was tainted from the start by suspicions of illegitimacy and fratricide. He was crowned at Kingston upon Thames sometime after Easter in 979, probably in early May, and at the approximate age of 12 or 13 years. He was a child thrust into kingship under the darkest of clouds, and the shadow of his brother's murder would follow him throughout his life. Ethelred's name meant noble counsel in Old English, a fitting name for a king, but history would remember him by his nickname, Unread, which has often been translated as the unready. This translation, however, is misleading. The Old English word unread meant something closer to no counsel or ill-advised. It was essentially a cruel pun on his name, suggesting that despite being named for good counsel, he received or followed bad advice. A more accurate translation would be poorly counselled or ill-advised, though the traditional unready has stuck in popular imagination. Whatever we call him, and Ethelred's reign would prove to be one of the most disastrous in English history. To be fair to the young king, he inherited a difficult situation. The Viking raids that had plagued England in earlier centuries had resumed with a renewed vigour in the 980s. These were not merely isolated raids by small bands of warriors seeking plunder. They were well-organised military campaigns led by powerful Scandinavian rulers with ambitions of conquest and permanent settlement. In the early years of his reign, while Ethelred was still a minor under the guidance of regents, the English defences held reasonably well. The kingdom had been well organised by his predecessors, with a network of fortified towns called burhs that could provide refuge during attacks, and a system of military obligation that could quickly raise armies when needed. The Viking raiders won some victories and took some plunder, but they could not break England's defences. But as Ethelred grew to adulthood and began ruling in his own right, problems emerged. He proved to be a poor judge of character, surrounding himself with advisors whose counsel was often self-serving or misguided. He struggled to maintain the loyalty of his nobles, particularly in the north and in Mercia, where local rulers had their own power bases and their own interests. Most critically, he seemed unable to develop a coherent strategy for dealing with the Viking threat. Rather than following the example of his great-great-grandfather Alfred and his great-grandfather Edward the Elder, who had built strong defences, maintained powerful fleets, and taken the fight to the Vikings, Ethelred chose a different path, and he attempted to buy peace. The year 991 marked a turning point in Ethelred's reign and in English history. In that year, a large Viking fleet arrived on England's shores led by Olaf Tryggvason, who would later become King of Norway. The Vikings landed at Ipswich in August and then moved to Malden in Essex, where they faced an English army led by ealdorman Byrhtnoth. The Battle of Malden became famous through an Old English poem that celebrated Byrhtnoth's courage, even as it recorded his defeat and death. The ealdorman had foolishly allowed the Vikings to cross from an island to the mainland to give battle on more equal terms, a decision that cost him his life and his army. After Byrhtnoth's death, the Viking force ravaged Essex and the surrounding regions. Faced with this defeat, Ethelred and his council made a fateful decision. Rather than raising new armies and continuing the fight, they chose to negotiate with the Vikings. They offered Olaf Tryggvason a massive payment, £22,000 of silver, in exchange for peace. Olaf accepted the payment and departed, and for the moment, the crisis seemed resolved. This payment of tribute to Viking raiders became known as Danegeld, literally Danish payment. At first glance, it seemed like a practical solution to an immediate problem. Why risk English lives in battle when gold and silver could achieve the same end? Why allow the Vikings to ravage the countryside when they could be persuaded to leave peacefully? The policy seemed to make economic and military sense, but it was a catastrophic strategic blunder. The payment of Danegeld sent a message to every ambitious Viking leader and Scandinavian king. England was wealthy, and its king would pay handsomely to avoid fighting. Rather than deterring attacks, the Danegeld encouraged them. More Viking fleets began arriving at English shores, confident that they would either win plunder through raiding or receive massive payments through negotiation. The amounts demanded grew steadily larger. In 994, after another Viking fleet attacked England, Ethelred paid £16,000. In 1002, he paid £24,000. In 1007, the payment had risen to £36,000. By 1012, he would pay an astronomical £48,000, enough silver to fund a kingdom for years, enough to build castles and ships and equip armies, all handed over to foreign raiders in a desperate attempt to buy temporary peace. These payments drained England's treasury and exhausted its resources. The money had to be raised through heavy taxation, which created resentment among nobles and commoners alike. Landowners who had to pay these taxes began to question whether their king was capable of defending them. The constant demands for Danegeld weakened the bonds of loyalty that held the kingdom together. Moreover, the policy created a perverse incentive for Viking raiders. Why go home when England would pay year after year? Some Vikings began spending winters in England, camping on islands and in coastal areas, ready to resume raiding or to demand another payment when spring came. England was being slowly bled dry, and the king seemed powerless to stop it. Ethelred's problems went beyond his flawed military strategy, and he was also a poor judge of character, who repeatedly placed his trust in men who betrayed that trust. The most notorious of these was Edric Streona, literally Edric the Grasper, whom Ethelred made ealdorman of Mercia in 1007. Edric was a man of low-born origins who rose through cunning and manipulation. He advised Ethelred to pursue policies that strengthened Edric's own power while weakening potential rivals. He betrayed allies, murdered opponents, and changed sides with bewildering frequency. Yet Ethelred continued to trust him, even marrying his daughter Edgith to Edric to strengthen their alliance. This union made Edric the king's son-in-law and gave him even more influence over royal policy. Ethelred's treatment of his nobles was erratic and often cruel. In 1006, he ordered the murder of Elfhelm, ealdorman of Northumbria, and had Elfhelm's 2 sons blinded. The exact reasons for these actions are unclear, but they suggest paranoia and a willingness to use violence against potential rivals. Such actions created fear and resentment among the nobility, undermining the king's support just when he needed unity most. The king's personal life was also complicated. His first wife, Elfgifu of York, had borne him at least 6 sons and several daughters before her death around 1002. These children represented the future of his dynasty, but they also represented potential challenges to his authority as they grew to adulthood. Medieval fathers and sons often found themselves in conflict over power and inheritance, and Ethelred's relationship with his elder sons was frequently strained. In 1002, shortly after Elfgifu's death, Ethelred married Emma of Normandy, a daughter of Duke Richard I of Normandy. This marriage was a political alliance intended to prevent the Normans from harbouring Viking raiders, as Normandy's ports had become bases for Viking fleets attacking England. Emma was probably in her late teens when she married the king, who was in his mid-30s and already had numerous children from his first marriage. The marriage to Emma created new tensions within the royal family. Emma's sons would have different claims and loyalties than Ethelred's sons by Elfgifu. The older princes must have viewed their new stepmother with suspicion, seeing her and her future children as threats to their own inheritance. These family divisions would have profound consequences in the years to come. On November 13th, 1002, the feast day of Saint Margaret, King Ethelred made perhaps the single worst decision of his entire reign. He issued an order for a massacre of Danes living in England. The exact scope and nature of this massacre remains debated by historians. Some accounts suggest it was intended to be a kingdom-wide elimination of all people of Danish descent. Other sources suggest it was more limited, targeting Danish mercenaries and recent settlers who were suspected of plotting against the king. What is certain is that violence did occur, and that among the victims was a woman named Gunhilda, who was sister to Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. The killing of Gunhilda transformed the situation completely. Up until this point, the Viking raids on England, while destructive and costly, had been essentially business ventures. Viking leaders attacked England to win plunder and tribute. It was about wealth, not vengeance. But the murder of Sweyn's sister made it personal. Sweyn Forkbeard was one of the most powerful rulers in Northern Europe. He was King of Denmark and controlled extensive territories around the Baltic. He had raided England before, and England had paid him tribute. But now he had a blood debt to collect. Now he had a personal reason to see Ethelred destroyed. The Danish revenge was swift and terrible. Beginning in 1003, Sweyn launched a series of devastating raids on England. These were not the hit-and-run attacks of earlier years. These were systematic campaigns of destruction and conquest. Sweyn's forces swept through the English countryside, burning, killing, and looting. They attacked major towns, defeated English armies, and demonstrated with brutal clarity that Ethelred's kingdom was defenseless. The English tried to resist. They raised armies, paid more Danegeld, built new ships, and attempted various defensive strategies. But nothing worked. Ethelred's leadership remained indecisive and ineffective. His nobles increasingly lost faith in him. Some began making private peace with the Danes. Others fled to monasteries or into exile. By 1013, after a decade of devastating warfare, Sweyn Forkbeard launched a full-scale invasion with the clear intent of conquering England and claiming its throne for himself. This was no longer a raid. It was a war of conquest. Sweyn brought with him his son Cnut, who would learn valuable lessons about English warfare and politics during this campaign. Sweyn's invasion in 1013 succeeded with shocking speed. The Danish army landed in the north and was immediately welcomed by the people of Northumbria and the Five Boroughs, who were tired of Ethelred's rule and willing to accept a Danish king if he could bring order. Town after town opened their gates to Sweyn. Nobles pledged their loyalty, and armies melted away without fighting. Ethelred attempted to organize resistance from London, but the situation was hopeless. His own nobles were abandoning him. Even London, the greatest city in his kingdom, eventually submitted to Sweyn. Faced with universal rejection and imminent capture, Ethelred made the humiliating decision to flee into exile. The king, his wife Emma, and their young children by their marriage, Edward, Alfred, and Godgifu, boarded ships and sailed to Normandy. Emma was returning to her brother's court, where she had grown up. Ethelred was fleeing to beg hospitality from his wife's family. It was a complete and total failure. The King of England reduced to a refugee. On Christmas Day, 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was formally recognized as King of England. The Danish conquest was complete. The House of Wessex, which had ruled England for centuries, had been overthrown. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom had fallen, but the Danish triumph was short-lived. In February 1014, just 5 weeks after being recognized as king, Sweyn Forkbeard died suddenly. Some sources suggest he died in his sleep. Others hint at illness. His death threw the political situation into chaos and confusion. Sweyn's son Cnut was proclaimed king by the Danish army in England, but his position was far from secure. Many English nobles saw an opportunity to restore native rule. Messengers were sent to Normandy with a proposition. If Ethelred would return and promise to rule more justly than before, they would accept him back as king. Ethelred, desperate to reclaim his throne, agreed to whatever terms were demanded. In spring 1014, he returned to England with Emma and their children. The restoration was complicated and uncertain. Many parts of England remained under Danish control, and Cnut still commanded a powerful army. But for the moment, Ethelred was king again, and there was hope that England might be saved from foreign conquest. That hope would prove tragically misplaced. Among Ethelred's sons by his first wife Elfgifu, there was one who stood out for his courage, military skill, and charisma. His name was Edmund, and he would earn the nickname Ironside for his tenacity and strength in battle. Edmund was probably born around 990, making him in his early 20s by the time his father returned from exile in 1014. He had grown up watching his father's failures, witnessing the destruction of the kingdom, and learning hard lessons about what it took to defend England against determined enemies. While his father had been weak and indecisive, Edmund was strong and determined. While Ethelred had failed to inspire loyalty, Edmund won the devotion of warriors and nobles through his courage and leadership. The relationship between Ethelred and his son Edmund was complex and often strained. Medieval chronicles suggest that Edmund was frustrated by his father's continued poor decisions, and that he sometimes acted independently, even in defiance of the king. This tension would come to a head in 1015 in a dramatic way. In that year, two powerful thegns, noblemen named Sigurfurth and Morcar, who controlled lands in the North and Midlands, came to an assembly at Oxford. They were summoned by the king, possibly to give account of themselves or to pledge loyalty. Instead, they were treacherously murdered on the orders of Edward the Exile, Ethelred's notorious son-in-law and advisor. After the murders, Ethelred seized Sigurfurth and Morcar's lands and possessions. He also ordered that Sigurfurth's widow, a woman named Ealdgyth, be seized and imprisoned in a monastery at Malmesbury. This was standard practice when dealing with potentially dangerous widows who might use their late husband's wealth and connections to cause trouble. But Edmund saw the situation differently. He saw an opportunity to build his own power base in the Midlands and North, where his father's authority was weak. He also may have felt genuine sympathy for Ealdgyth, who had committed no crime, but was being punished for her late husband's supposed offences. In a dramatic act of defiance, Edmund rode to Malmesbury, rescued Ealdgyth from her imprisonment, and married her against his father's explicit orders. This was an extraordinary rebellion, not armed revolt, but a public rejection of the king's authority by his own son. Edmund then travelled to the lands that had belonged to Sigurfurth and Morcar and received the submission of the people there, effectively claiming those territories for himself. Ethelred was furious, but he was also powerless. He could not afford to fight his own son when Danish armies threatened from multiple directions. Edmund had gambled correctly. His father needed him too much to punish him severely. The marriage to Ealdgyth stood, and Edmund's power base in the Midlands was secure. This marriage would prove crucial to our story, because Ealdgyth would become the mother of Edward the Exile. Through this union, forged in defiance and political calculation, the last legitimate line of the House of Wessex would be preserved. While father and son manoeuvred for position and influence, the Danish threat was far from over. Cnut had withdrawn from England after his father's death, but he had not given up on claiming the English throne. In August 1015, he returned with a massive invasion force, determined to complete what his father had begun. What followed was a year of brutal, devastating warfare. Cnut's army was large, well-equipped, and disciplined. It included not only Danes, but also warriors from Norway and other parts of Scandinavia, drawn by the promise of plunder and land in wealthy England. Against this force, England's defences crumbled. Ethelred, now elderly and seriously ill, could do little to organise resistance. His authority had eroded to the point where many nobles simply refused to answer his summons to arms. Some actively went over to Cnut's side, calculating that the Danish prince would soon be king, and wanting to be on the winning side. Chief among these traitors was Edward the Exile, who switched his allegiance from Ethelred to Cnut, bringing his forces over to the Danish side. it fell to Edmund to lead England's defence, despite the impossible situation, facing a larger and better organised army with inadequate support from his father. Edmund proved to be a remarkable military commander. He raised armies, won battles, and inspired his followers with his courage and determination. He fought Cnut in Wessex, in Mercia, in East Anglia, never giving up, never admitting defeat. But in April 1016, in the midst of this desperate war, King Ethelred died in London. He was probably only about 50 years old, but years of stress, failure, and illness had taken their toll. His death ended one of the longest and most disastrous reigns in English history. With Ethelred's death, Edmund was proclaimed king by his supporters in London. However, he was not universally recognised. A meeting of the Witan, the Council of Nobles and Churchmen in Southampton, chose instead to submit to Cnut and recognise him as king. England now had two kings, each commanding armies, each claiming the throne, and each determined to be the sole ruler of a united kingdom. The months between April and November 1016 saw some of the fiercest fighting in English history. Edmund, now officially King Edmund II, but known to history as Edmund Ironside, proved himself to be everything his father had not been: brave, decisive, and inspiring. He won several battles against Cnut's forces, demonstrating tactical skill and personal courage that earned him the respect even of his enemies. But Cnut had advantages that Edmund could not overcome. The Danish prince had more troops, better supplies, and the support of many English nobles who had calculated that resistance was futile. Moreover, Edmund was betrayed repeatedly by men he should have been able to count on. Most notably, Edric Striona switched sides again, abandoning Cnut and returning to Edmund's service, only to betray him at a critical moment. The decisive battle came in October 1016 at Assanden, probably modern Ashington in Essex. Edmund's army fought bravely, but at a crucial moment in the battle, Edric Striona led his forces away from the fighting, deliberately abandoning Edmund. Without these troops, Edmund's line broke, and the English were defeated. After this crushing defeat, Edmund recognized that he could not win a total victory. His kingdom was devastated by years of war. His treasury was empty. His nobles were exhausted. Cnut, seeing that Edmund would continue fighting indefinitely, and that completely conquering England might be impossible, was also willing to negotiate. The two kings met, probably on the island of Alney in the River Severn, and reached an agreement. Edmund would rule Wessex and the traditional heartland of the House of Wessex in the south. Cnut would control Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, effectively the northern and eastern portions of England. They would rule as two kings, and whichever survived the other would inherit the entire kingdom. This agreement might have brought lasting peace, and eventually unified England under whichever king proved stronger or longer lived. But fate had other plans. On November 30th, 1016, just 6 weeks after the agreement at Alney, Edmund Ironside died suddenly in Oxford, or possibly London. The sources disagree. He was not yet 30 years old and had been king for only 7 months. The exact cause of Edmund's death remains one of history's mysteries, as some contemporary sources suggest natural causes, perhaps wounds from battle that became infected, or illness brought on by the incredible stress and physical demands of his year of constant warfare. He had fought multiple battles, endured harsh campaigning conditions, and pushed his body to its limits. It would not be surprising if such a life had weakened his constitution and made him vulnerable to disease. But darker rumours circulated almost immediately. Some sources hint at assassination, suggesting that supporters of Cnut, or perhaps Edric Striona, acting in his own interests, murdered the king to ensure Danish control of all England. Later medieval chroniclers would embellish these stories with gruesome details about how Edmund was murdered. Though these accounts are probably more legend than fact, what we know for certain is that Edmund's sudden death left Cnut as the undisputed ruler of all England, with no adult rivals for the throne, with the military power to crush any resistance, and with the support of many English nobles who were tired of warfare. Cnut could finally claim the crown that his father had briefly held. Edmund was buried at Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, in the heart of Wessex, the kingdom his ancestors had ruled for centuries. His tomb would become a site of pilgrimage for those who remembered the last English king who had truly fought to defend his kingdom. Edmund's death left behind a young widow, Ealdgyth, and 2 infant sons. These boys represented the last legitimate male heirs of the House of Wessex in direct line of descent. As Edmund's sons, as grandsons of Ethelred, and as descendants of Alfred the Great, they had better hereditary claims to the English throne than Cnut, whose only claim was conquest. The elder boy was named Edward, after his great-uncle Edward the Martyr, and following the royal tradition of naming children after ancestors. The younger boy was named Edmund, after his father. These 2 small children, probably neither of them older than a year or 2 at most, were all that remained of England's ancient royal dynasty, and that is precisely why they were so dangerous to Cnut's new regime. This, then, was the world into which our protagonist Edward had been born, a world of warfare, betrayal, and conquest, a world where his father had fought valiantly but died mysteriously, a world where his family's kingdom had been seized by foreign invaders, a world where his very existence made him a threat to the most powerful king in Northern Europe. Edward was born into chaos, and that chaos would define his entire life. Let us imagine, for a moment, the scene in those final days of 1016 or early weeks of 1017. Somewhere in England, perhaps in Oxford, where Edmund died, perhaps in London, perhaps at Ealdgyth's estates in the Midlands, there is a young widow grieving for her husband. Ealdgyth had been married to Siegfried before Edmund, and now Edmund too was dead, taken from her after barely 2 years of marriage. She had 2 baby sons to protect, and no husband to defend them. Did Ealdgyth understand the danger her children were in? Did she realize that Cnut would never allow them to live? Or did she hope that the Danish king, having won everything, might show mercy to 2 helpless infants who posed no immediate threat? We will never know what Ealdgyth thought or felt in those desperate days, because she disappears from the historical record shortly after Edmund's death. Some historians speculate that she died in childbirth if Edmund's youngest son was born shortly before or after the king's death. Others suggest she may have taken refuge in a religious house, withdrawing from the world to protect herself and her children. Still others wonder if she met a darker fate, eliminated by those who wanted to remove all obstacles to Danish rule. What we do know is that sometime in 1017, Edward and his brother came into Cnut's custody. Whether they were seized by force, handed over by nobles seeking Cnut's favour, or surrendered by family members trying to save their own lives, and the result was the same. 2 infant princes, the last heirs of the House of Wessex, were now prisoners of the man who had conquered their kingdom. Cnut now faced a dilemma that confronted many successful conquerors throughout history. He had won England through force of arms, defeating armies and forcing nobles to submit, but conquering a kingdom and ruling it successfully were 2 very different things. To rule effectively, Cnut needed to win not just submission, but genuine acceptance from the English people. He needed to transform himself from foreign invader to legitimate king. This transformation required careful political management. Cnut had to reward those who had supported him, neutralize those who had opposed him, and win over those who were undecided. He had to show himself as a strong ruler who could maintain order, a more just king who would rule fairly, and a Christian monarch who respected English laws and traditions. Openly murdering two infant princes would undermine all of these goals. It would brand him as a monster in the eyes of his new subjects. It would confirm the worst fears of those who saw him as a brutal foreign tyrant rather than a legitimate king. It would create martyrs whose memory might inspire resistance for generations. But allowing the boys to live in England was equally impossible. As long as they survived, they would be potential rallying points for rebellion. Any discontented noble could claim to be acting in their name. Any uprising against Danish rule could position one of them as the rightful king. They were too dangerous to keep alive, but killing them openly was too politically risky. Cnut's solution was characteristically cunning. He would send the boys away, far away, to a place where they could be quietly eliminated without the murders being traced back to him. Let them die in some distant land, and let the English people believe they had succumbed to illness or accident. Cnut would have his hands clean while still removing the threat. According to John of Worcester, writing in the early 12th century, but drawing on earlier sources now lost, Cnut decided to send the boys to Sweden. His choice of destination was not random. King Olof Skötkonung of Sweden was either Cnut's half-brother or stepbrother. The exact relationship is unclear in the sources, as medieval family relationships were often complicated by polygamy, concubinage, and blended families. What matters is that Olof and Cnut were closely related through family ties, and Cnut had reason to believe he could trust Olof to carry out his wishes. The chronicle tells us that one of Cnut's advisors, the infamous Edward Streona, counseled the king on how to handle the situation. Edric, who had betrayed every master he had ever served, understood the politics of murder better than most. He told Cnut that it would be shameful if the princes died in England, where the murders might provoke English outrage. Better to send them abroad, where their deaths would be distant and abstract. And so the order was given. Edward and his brother, neither of them old enough to walk, neither of them old enough to remember England, were to be placed on a ship and sent across the North Sea to Sweden. They were to be accompanied by trusted men who would deliver secret instructions to King Olaf. The boys were to be murdered. Can we imagine that journey? A ship departing from an English port, perhaps London, perhaps one of the East Coast harbours, carrying its precious and doomed cargo. The North Sea in winter or early spring could be treacherous, with high waves and storms that could swamp even large vessels. The voyage might take several days or even weeks, depending on winds and weather. The two infant boys, torn from whatever nurse or family member had been caring for them, would have been crying and frightened. They would not understand why they were being taken onto a ship, why they were leaving everything familiar. If they were still being nursed, had Cnut allowed a wet nurse to travel with them? Or were they being weaned too early, adding hunger to their distress? The men guarding them knew they were escorting these children to their deaths. Did this knowledge weigh on them? Or had they grown callous, seeing the boys as simply obstacles to be removed, pieces in a political game rather than human beings with rights to life? The chronicles don't tell us, and we can only wonder whether any of these guards felt any sympathy for the innocents in their charge. The ship crossed the North Sea, perhaps stopping at ports along the way for supplies and shelter, eventually reaching Sweden. The boys were presented to King Olaf's court, along with Cnut's message and instructions. Here, in a foreign land, far from anyone who might protect them, far from the kingdom that was rightfully theirs, the murderous orders were to be carried out. And then something remarkable happened. Something that would change not just Edward's life, but the entire course of English and European history. King Olof Skötkonung, upon receiving Cnut's instructions to murder the infant princes, refused to carry them out. This refusal requires some explanation. because it was not at all what Cnut expected. Kings and powerful nobles of the medieval period regularly eliminated potential rivals, often including children. Succession struggles routinely involved the murder of inconvenient heirs. Olaf had no particular reason to feel bound by English laws or customs, and he certainly had no obligation to protect Ethelred's grandsons. So why did he refuse? The sources give us partial answers. Some chronicles suggest that Olaf had been an ally of King Ethelred in earlier years and felt bound by ties of loyalty to protect Ethelred's grandsons. This makes some political sense. Olaf and Ethelred may have had treaties or agreements, and Olaf might have felt obligated to honour those connections even after Ethelred's death. Others historians point to religious motivations. By 1017, Sweden was in the process of converting to Christianity, though the conversion was far from complete. Olaf himself had been baptized as a Christian, and Christian teaching strongly condemned the murder of innocents. Perhaps Olaf's newfound Christian faith made him recoil from the idea of killing 2 babies who had done no wrong. There may also have been practical political calculations. Olaf might have recognized that circumstances change and that someday these boys might be valuable. Kings who protected exiled princes sometimes found themselves rewarded when those princes came to power. Alternatively, Olaf might have been reluctant to do Cnut a favour that would increase the Danish king's power. Denmark and Sweden were rivals, and helping Cnut consolidate his position might not have been in Sweden's interests. Whatever his reasons, Olaf made the momentous decision to spare the boys' lives, but he also recognized that he couldn't simply keep them in Sweden indefinitely. Having them at his court was dangerous. If Cnut discovered that his orders hadn't been followed, it could damage Swedish-Danish relations. Olaf needed to send the boys somewhere else, somewhere far enough away that Cnut wouldn't bother pursuing them, but safe enough that they would survive and be properly cared for. This is where the historical record becomes frustratingly unclear, with different sources giving contradictory accounts of what happened next. The basic facts are agreed upon. The boys were sent further east, probably to either the Kingdom of Hungary or the Kievan Rus, the state centered on Kiev, or possibly to both in succession. But the details of their journey, the timing, and the exact route they took are all subject to scholarly debate. One possibility is that Olaf sent the boys directly to Hungary, to the court of King Stephen I. Stephen was married to Gisela of Bavaria, and through her had connections to the Holy Roman Emperor and to many of the great noble families of Europe. Hungary was far from Denmark's power, a Christian kingdom that was in the process of establishing itself as a major European power. It was also a place where the boys would be welcomed and protected. Another possibility, supported by several medieval sources, is that the boys went first to Kiev. The chronicler, Adam of Bremen, writing in the late 11th century, says that they were condemned to exile in Russia, using Russia to mean Kievan Rus. The Leges Edwardi Confessoris, compiled in the 12th century, states that they were received by Yaroslav the Wise, the Grand Prince of Kiev. This alternative route makes good sense. Kiev was even further from Denmark's reach than Hungary. Grand Prince Yaroslav was one of the most powerful rulers in Eastern Europe, controlling vast territories and commanding formidable military forces. He had extensive diplomatic connections throughout Europe and welcomed exiled princes and nobles at his court. His daughter Anna would later marry King Henry I of France, and another daughter, Ingigerd, had married King Olaf of Sweden, creating a direct family connection that might explain why Olaf chose to send the boys to Kiev. Some historians have proposed that the boys spent several years in Kiev before being sent on to Hungary. This theory suggests that after Cnut conquered Norway and part of Sweden in 1028, making his power even more dominant in Scandinavia, keeping the boys in Kiev became too dangerous. They were then sent to Hungary, where they would be safer and where they eventually built their lives. The truth is that we simply don't know the exact path the boys took. Medieval chroniclers were not always careful about details, and accounts written a century after the events were often based on partial or confused information. What matters for our story is the endpoint. Somehow, through the kindness and mercy of various rulers who chose not to murder them, Edward and his brother made their way to Hungary, where they would spend most of their lives. Can we imagine what this journey must have been like? If the boys went by way of Kiev, they would have travelled up rivers through Poland, or along trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. If they went directly to Hungary, the route would have been overland through the German lands or along the Danube River. Either way, it was a journey of hundreds of miles, taking weeks or months, through territories that spoke different languages and followed different customs. And the boys were too young to remember England. As they grew older, they would have no personal memory of the land of their birth, no recollection of their father or grandfather, no first-hand knowledge of the kingdom they had lost. England would be a story told to them by others, a place of legend rather than lived experience. They were being transformed from English princes into something else, into permanent exiles, into men who would belong fully to no single place or culture. And all of this happened because various people, at various times, chose mercy over murder. King Olaf could have killed them, but didn't. The rulers of Kiev or Hungary who received them could have sent them back or eliminated them quietly, but chose instead to give them shelter. It was a chain of unlikely mercies, and each link forged by individual decisions that went against the brutal logic of medieval power politics. Edward survived his infancy not through his own actions or merits, he was too young for that, but through the choices of others. His survival was almost miraculous, a series of fortunate accidents that defied the odds, and that survival would have consequences that echoed through centuries of history, affecting not just Edward's own life but the lives of countless others, reshaping the royal houses of England and Scotland, and ultimately changing the course of British history. But all of that lay in the future. For now, Edward was simply an infant exile, a displaced prince in a foreign land, unaware of his own importance or of the dramatic life that lay ahead of him. Hungary in the early 11th century was a kingdom undergoing one of the most dramatic transformations in European history. It was a land caught between its pagan past and its Christian future, between nomadic traditions and settled civilization, between isolation and integration into the broader European community. Into this world of change and possibility came two small English boys, refugees from a distant land, bearing names and bloodlines that meant nothing to most Hungarians, but everything to the future of England. To understand Edward's life in Hungary, we must first understand the kingdom that sheltered him. Hungary was one of Europe's newest states, forged by the Magyar people, who had swept out of the Eurasian steppes in the late 9th century. These Magyars were fierce mounted warriors, related to the Huns, who had terrorized Europe centuries earlier, and their initial impact on European civilization was devastating. For decades, Magyar raiders had swept through Germany, Italy, and the Balkans, pillaging and burning, carrying away captives and treasure. They were the terror of Eastern Europe, and Christian chroniclers compared them to biblical plagues sent to punish sinful humanity. But gradually, through a combination of military defeats, diplomatic marriages, and the attraction of Christianity, the Magyars began to settle down, to farm the rich plains of the Danube basin, and to build a kingdom rather than simply raiding neighboring lands. The man most responsible for this transformation was King Stephen I, who ruled Hungary from the year 1000 until his death in 1038. Stephen was born as Vaik Ed, the son of Grand Prince Geza, but he took the Christian name Stephen at his baptism and dedicated his life to transforming Hungary into a Christian kingdom that would take its place among the great powers of Europe. Stephen's coronation in the year 1000 was laden with symbolic significance. The crown he wore had been sent by Pope Sylvester II, symbolizing that Stephen's authority came from God and from the Church, not merely from military power or tribal tradition. This Holy Crown of Hungary, or one very like it, would become one of the most sacred symbols of Hungarian identity, revered for centuries as embodying the nation's sovereignty. But receiving a crown from the Pope was the easy part. Actually transforming Hungarian society from a confederation of Magyar tribes with pagan traditions into a centralized Christian kingdom with European-style administration required decades of patient, often brutal work. Stephen built churches and monasteries throughout his realm, establishing Christianity not just as the king's religion, but as the religion of the Hungarian people. He invited foreign missionaries, especially from Germany and Italy, to teach and preach. He organized his kingdom into counties with appointed officials rather than relying on traditional tribal structures. This transformation was resisted by many Magyars who clung to the old ways. Stephen faced several serious rebellions during his reign, particularly from his uncle Kopani, who led a pagan revolt shortly after Stephen took power. These rebellions were crushed with extreme violence. Stephen understood that compromise on the religious question would undermine his entire program. The story was told that after defeating Kopani, Stephen had his body cut into 4 pieces, which were displayed in different cities as a warning to other potential rebels. By the time Edward and his brother arrived in Hungary, probably in the late 1010s, Stephen's transformation of the kingdom was well advanced, but far from complete. Churches stood in major towns, and Hungary had been divided into dioceses with bishops appointed by the king. Monasteries were being built, bringing not just Christianity, but also literacy, learning, and European cultural practices. Foreign nobles and knights had been invited to settle in Hungary, bringing new military techniques and administrative skills. But beneath this Christian and European veneer, older Magyar traditions persisted. In the countryside, away from the major centers, many people still followed traditional beliefs alongside or instead of Christianity. The Hungarian language had no real writing system yet, so administration and religion both had to be conducted in Latin, creating a divide between the Latinized elite and the Magyar-speaking common people. Into this complex, transitional society came 2 English boys who spoke neither Hungarian nor Latin, who knew nothing of local customs, and who had no family or protectors except for whatever attendants might have travelled with them from Sweden or Kiev. Hungary's position as a new kingdom seeking to establish itself in European politics made it, paradoxically, an ideal refuge for exiled princes and displaced nobles from across Europe. Stephen understood that hosting exiles could bring diplomatic benefits. A king who protected displaced royalty might someday find those royals restored to their thrones, creating grateful allies. At the very least, hosting exiles demonstrated Hungary's emergence as a civilized Christian kingdom, capable of showing mercy and hospitality. The Hungarian court already hosted several other exiles when Edward arrived. Some were Germans fleeing political troubles in the Holy Roman Empire. Others were refugees from the Byzantine Empire's endless civil wars. There were displaced nobles from various Slavic principalities. The court was a polyglot mixture of languages and cultures, a cosmopolitan center in a kingdom that was itself struggling to define its identity. King Stephen and Queen Gisela took Edward and his brother under their protection. This was not merely charity, but a calculated political decision. The boys represented one of the oldest royal dynasties in Europe. The House of Wessex traced its ancestry back through Alfred the Great to legendary kings of the 5th and 6th centuries. Protecting them cost little and might someday prove valuable. But what did this protection actually mean for two small children far from home? They were housed at court, probably in apartments reserved for royal wards and guests. They would have been assigned attendants, possibly Hungarian nobles assigned to oversee their upbringing, possibly foreign servants who spoke languages the boys could learn. If any English-speaking people were at the Hungarian court, merchants, missionaries, my other exiles, they might have been arranged to teach the boys their native language, or what should have been their native language. Food would have been strange to English tastes. The Hungarians ate differently from the English, with more emphasis on meat from herds, and less on the bread and ale that were staples of the English diet. The climate was different too. Hungary had hotter summers and colder winters than the boys would have experienced in England. Even the sounds and smells of the place would have been foreign. The Hungarian language, with its complex grammar and agglutinative structure, sounded nothing like English or any other Germanic language. As Edward grew from infant to toddler to child, he would have gradually absorbed Hungarian culture and language. Children are remarkably adaptable, and Edward would have learned Hungarian from the people around him, probably speaking it with native fluency by the age of 4 or 5. This would have been his primary language, the tongue in which he thought and dreamed, despite his English ancestry. But his guardians would have made sure he understood who he was. He was Edward, son of Edmund Ironside, grandson of Ethelred, great-great-great-great-grandson of Alfred the Great. He was an Etheling, an English prince eligible for kingship. He carried the blood of kings who had ruled England for centuries, and someday, perhaps, he might return to claim his inheritance. These lessons about his identity would have been repeated throughout his childhood. He would have been told stories about his father's courage, how about Edmund Ironside, who fought battle after battle against the Danish invaders, who never surrendered even when defeat seemed certain. He would have learned about Alfred the Great, the legendary king who saved England from Viking conquest centuries earlier, who was both a warrior and a scholar, who built monasteries and fortresses, who created England's first navy. He would have learned that he was not Hungarian, despite speaking Hungarian and living in Hungary. He was English, an exile who might someday go home. This dual identity, Hungarian in practice but English in blood and heritage, would have shaped his entire world view and sense of self. As a prince, even an exiled one, Edward would have received an education appropriate to nobility. In the medieval world, this meant primarily training for warfare and for governance, and supplemented by religious instruction and, for the more intellectually inclined, some learning in letters. From about age 7, the traditional age when noble boys began their serious education, Edward would have started training in the skills of a warrior. This training was not optional or recreational. It was the essential preparation for the life he was expected to lead. Warfare was the business of kings and nobles, and a man who could not fight was not fit to rule. Edward would have been taught to ride horses, not just competently, but expertly. The Magyars were renowned horsemen, descendants of steppe nomads for whom the horse was essential to life itself. Hungarian nobles could shoot arrows while riding at full gallop, could execute complex maneuvers in formation, could spend entire days in the saddle without complaint. Edward would have absorbed these skills, learning to become as comfortable on horseback as on foot. He would have trained with weapons of all types. The sword was the primary weapon of the noble warrior, symbol of his status and primary tool in battle. Edward would have practiced sword fighting from childhood, learning the stances, cuts and parries that could mean the difference between life and death. By the time he reached adulthood, he would have been able to fight for hours without tiring, his movements automatic and precise. He would also have learned to use the lance, the weapon employed in mounted charges when cavalry crashed into enemy lines. He would have trained with axes, with knives, with any weapon that might be needed in battle. He would have learned to wear armor, heavy mail shirts that could turn a sword blow, but were exhaustingly hot and restrictive. He would have learned to fight in that armor, moving despite the weight, maintaining balance and agility while encased in metal. Beyond individual combat skills, Edward would have learned strategy and tactics, how to position an army for battle, how to interpret terrain and use it to advantage, how to maintain supply lines on campaign, how to siege a castle or defend one. These were the skills that distinguished a competent warrior from a capable commander. The training would have been brutal and unrelenting. Mock combats with wooden swords could still break bones and leave bruises. Falls from horses during riding practice could cause serious injury. But this was considered necessary. Better to suffer injuries in training than to be unprepared for real battle, where mistakes meant death. Alongside military training, Edward would have received extensive instruction in Christianity. King Stephen's Hungary was intensely religious, and the king saw Christianity as essential to Hungary's identity and legitimacy. Edward would have been expected to be not just a warrior, but a Christian warrior, a defender of the faith. He would have been taught to read Latin, the language of the Church, and of learning throughout Europe. This was probably difficult. Medieval Latin was quite different from the evolving Romance languages, and for a boy whose native tongue was Hungarian, mastering Latin grammar and vocabulary required years of work. But it was essential education for anyone aspiring to rule or to be taken seriously in European politics. Through Latin, Edward would have accessed the scriptures and the writings of the Church Fathers. He would have learned the stories of the Bible, the creation, the flood, the exodus from Egypt, the life of Christ, the Acts of the Apostles. He would have memorized prayers and psalms, learning to recite them in Latin even if his understanding of the words was imperfect. He would have been taught Christian theology and morality, the nature of God as Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the story of salvation through Christ's death and resurrection, the importance of the sacraments, baptism, confirmation, communion, penance, marriage, holy orders, and extreme unction, the difference between mortal sins that damn the soul and venial sins that could be forgiven, the reality of heaven and hell, of angels and demons, of saints and their miracles. Regular attendance at Mass would have been required, probably daily. Edward would have knelt in Hungarian churches and chapels, listening to services conducted in Latin, surrounded by people praying in Hungarian. He would have observed the great festivals of the Christian year, Christmas celebrating Christ's birth, Easter commemorating his resurrection, Pentecost marking the descent of the Holy Spirit, feast days honoring various saints. This religious education was not just about belief, but about behavior. Christianity taught that kings ruled by God's grace and were accountable to God for how they treated their subjects. A Christian king was supposed to be just, merciful, and devoted to protecting his people and the church. These ideals were emphasized repeatedly in Edward's education, shaping his understanding of what kingship meant and what would be expected of him if he ever claimed his throne. As Edward entered his teenage years and then young adulthood, his daily life would have followed the rhythms of Hungarian noble society. He would have attended court ceremonies and feasts, learning the social skills necessary for navigating the complex hierarchies and relationships of aristocratic life. He would have gone hunting with other young nobles, both for recreation and to hone the tracking, riding, and combat skills used in warfare. Hunting was not just sport but training. The techniques used to track and kill deer, wild boar, bears, and other game were very similar to military reconnaissance and combat. A good hunter needed to read terrain, understand weather, track prey silently, coordinate with others, and strike precisely at the right moment. All skills that translated directly to warfare. Moreover, hunting was where noble youths bonded, forming the friendships and alliances that would serve them throughout their lives. Edward would have formed friendships with other young Hungarian nobles, boys who were growing up alongside him and who shared his interests and education. Some of these friendships would have been genuine personal connections. Others would have been more strategic, forging alliances between families and creating networks of mutual support. In medieval society, personal relationships were political relationships, and every friendship could have significance beyond mere companionship. There would have been entertainment and culture too. Hungarian nobles enjoyed music, poetry, and storytelling. They held feasts where bards sang songs celebrating great deeds and heroic ancestors. They told stories around fires on hunting trips, mixing Christian morality tales with older Magyar legends. Edward would have absorbed all of this, becoming culturally Hungarian, even as he maintained his English identity. As he grew older, he would have been given increasing responsibilities. He might have been assigned to oversee some of the royal estates, learning the practical skills of managing land, collecting rents, administering justice, and maintaining order. He might have been sent on diplomatic missions to other Hungarian nobles, or to foreign courts, representing King Stephen's interests. These responsibilities would have given him practical experience in governance and administration. Throughout all of this, we must remember that Edward had a brother, the younger Edmund. The sources tell us almost nothing about this boy's life or character. We don't know if the brothers were close or distant, whether they supported each other through the difficulties of exile or competed for attention and resources. We don't know if Edmund was as capable and ambitious as Edward, or more content to live quietly in Hungary. What we do know is that Edmund died before Edward's return to England in 1057. An 11th century psalter records that an Edmund Clitus, Etheling, died on January 10th, though the year is not specified. This must be Edward's brother, the other son of Edmund Ironside, and most historians believe he died in the late 1040s or early 1050s, possibly during the succession crisis following King Stephen's death. Some sources hint that Edmund married a Hungarian noblewoman and might have had children, though the evidence is extremely thin. If this is true, then there might have been other descendants of Edmund Ironside living in Hungary, children who carried Anglo-Saxon royal blood, but who never played any role in English history. Edmund's death, whenever it occurred, left Edward as the sole surviving son of Edmund Ironside. This made Edward's position more significant, but also more lonely. He was now the only male heir of his line, the last hope for his family's restoration. The responsibility of carrying on the bloodline rested entirely on his shoulders. In August 1038, King Stephen I died after ruling Hungary for nearly 4 decades. His death was a devastating blow to the kingdom he had built. Stephen had no surviving male heirs. His son Emmerich had died in a hunting accident years earlier, and the old king had outlived most of his close relatives. The question of who would succeed him threatened to tear Hungary apart. Stephen had designated his nephew Peter Orseolo as his heir, but Peter was unpopular. He was seen as too close to the German Holy Roman Empire and too willing to subordinate Hungarian interest to German power. Many Hungarian nobles rejected Peter's claim and supported various other claimants to the throne. What followed was a period of chaos and civil war that must have been deeply unsettling for Edward, now in his early 20s. For the stable kingdom where he had grown up was suddenly convulsed by violence as different factions fought for control. Peter Orseolo briefly became king, but was overthrown in 1041. Samuel Aber, Peter's brother-in-law, seized power but ruled tyrannically, and was himself overthrown in 1044, when Peter returned with German military support. During this turbulent period, Edward would have had to navigate carefully, maintaining his position at court, while avoiding becoming too closely associated with any particular faction. He had built a life in Hungary over more than 20 years, had friends and possibly estates, and the political instability threatened everything he had achieved. It was during this period of turmoil that another exiled Hungarian prince returned from abroad to claim his rightful place. His name was Andrew, and his return would give Edward an opportunity to prove himself in battle and to secure his position in Hungarian society once and for all. Prince Andrew of Hungary had been living in exile himself, having fled Hungary years earlier during one of the earlier succession crises that had plagued the kingdom. He had found refuge at the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, where he had likely spent time in the same circles as Edward and his brother had they passed through Kiev on their journey to Hungary. By 1046, Andrew had decided the time was right to return to Hungary and claim the throne. King Peter Orseolo's rule had become increasingly unpopular. His subservience to the Holy Roman Empire had alienated Hungarian nobles who valued their independence. His heavy taxation and arbitrary rule had created widespread discontent. Andrew recognized that with sufficient military force and the support of disaffected nobles, he could overthrow Peter and establish himself as king. Andrew returned to Hungary with an army supplied by his father-in-law, Yaroslav, crossing the Carpathian Mountains and entering Hungary from the northeast. Hungarian nobles who had been waiting for an opportunity to rebel against Peter flocked to Andrew's banner. What had started as an invasion by an exile quickly became a civil war, as Hungarian forces divided between supporters of Peter and supporters of Andrew. Here we encounter one of the few concrete facts we have about Edward's adult life in Hungary. He joined Andrew's cause. The sources tell us that Edward fought alongside Andrew in his campaign to seize the Hungarian throne. This single fact tells us a great deal about the man Edward had become and the position he held in Hungarian society. First, it tells us that Edward had become a warrior, not just in training, but in practice. He was willing and able to go to war, to risk his life in battle, to endure the hardships of military campaigns. Medieval warfare was brutal. Soldiers marched long distances carrying heavy equipment, fought in armor under the sun or in the rain, lived on whatever food they could find or carry, slept on the ground or in hastily erected camps. Edward had been trained for this life since childhood, and now he was living it. Second, it tells us that Edward had formed a personal relationship with Andrew, close enough that when Andrew needed warriors for his bid for the throne, Edward was willing to support him. And this might have been a relationship forged during time spent together in Kiev, if both had been at Yaroslav's court, or they might have become friends in Hungary, perhaps bonding as fellow exiles who understood what it meant to be displaced princes far from home. Third, it tells us something about Edward's judgment and political acumen. By joining Andrew's cause, Edward was taking a significant risk. If Andrew lost, Edward's life and position would be in danger, but Edward must have calculated that Andrew had good chances of success and that supporting him would bring rewards. This proved to be correct. Andrew's campaign succeeded. We don't know the details of the individual battles and skirmishes in Andrew's campaign. Medieval chroniclers often recorded only the outcomes of wars, not the day-to-day reality of campaigning. But we can reconstruct the general outline of what must have happened and what Edward would have experienced. Andrew's army, reinforced by Hungarian nobles who had joined his cause, marched across Hungary challenging Peter's authority. Towns and castles that remained loyal to Peter would have had to be besieged or bypassed. Battles would have been fought, probably several of them, as Peter attempted to rally his forces and crush the rebellion. Medieval battles were terrifying experiences. Armies would form up in lines, with heavily armoured cavalry on the flanks and infantry in the centre. The two sides would advance toward each other, shields raised, weapons ready. The moment of contact was extraordinarily violent. Lines of men crashing into each other, stabbing with spears, swinging swords and axes, and trying to break through the enemy formation. Men fell wounded or dead, their blood soaking into the earth. The noise would have been overwhelming, thousands of men shouting, weapons clanging against armour and shields, horses screaming, wounded men crying out. Edward, fighting in the thick of this chaos, would have had to keep his wits about him. One mistake, a moment of inattention, a misplaced step, a blow not quite blocked, could mean death. Warriors fought in groups, trying to protect each other. But in the confusion of battle, it was easy to become separated and vulnerable. He would have seen men die, probably including some he knew. He might have killed men himself, running them through with his sword or knocking them down to be finished by others. Medieval warfare was personal and visceral in a way that modern warfare with its long-range weapons is not. You looked your enemy in the face as you tried to kill him. Between battles, the campaign would have involved long marches, uncomfortable camps, inadequate food, and constant uncertainty. Disease killed more soldiers than combat in medieval warfare. Dysentery, typhus, and other infections spread rapidly through camps where thousands of men lived in close quarters without proper sanitation. Edward would have had to endure all of this alongside the common soldiers, sharing their hardships even if he had slightly better accommodations as a noble. But Andrew's cause prevailed. Peter Orseolo was defeated and fled Hungary. Andrew was crowned king, taking the name Andrew I, and began the work of establishing his authority over the kingdom. For those who had supported him, including Edward, this was a moment of triumph and vindication. They had bet correctly, had risked their lives for the winning side, and now they could expect rewards. Gratitude from a newly crowned king could take many forms. Andrew needed to reward those who had fought for him, both to repay their loyalty and to ensure their continued support. For noble warriors like Edward, the traditional reward was land, estates that would provide income and establish them as independent landholders rather than mere courtiers dependent on royal favour. There is intriguing evidence that Edward did receive such rewards. A fascinating local tradition in Hungary claims that Edward was granted an estate called Terra Britannorum de Nadast, literally the land of the Britons at Nadast, which included Reka Castle. The name itself is significant. Land of the Britons appears to be a reference to Edward's English origins. Medieval writers sometimes used Britain or Britain to refer to England, though technically Britain also included Wales and Scotland. If this tradition is accurate, it tells us several important things. First, it suggests that Edward's English identity remained known and significant even after decades in Hungary. He wasn't just another Hungarian noble. He was the English prince, the exile from distant Britain. Second, it indicates that Edward had achieved substantial status and wealth. Estates with castles were not minor grants. They were significant holdings that brought with them considerable income from rents, agricultural production, and control over local justice and administration. Some historians have suggested that this grant might have been made even before King Stephen's death in 1038, which would mean Edward had received lands while still relatively young, perhaps in his early 20s. Others believe it more likely that the grant came from Andrew I as a reward for Edward's service in the 1046 campaign. The evidence is too thin to be certain, But what matters is that by the late 1040s, Edward was established as a landholder in Hungary, with estates and a castle to his name. This meant Edward was no longer merely an exile living on the charity of others. He was a lord in his own right, with tenants farming his lands, as soldiers owing him military service, and income flowing into his treasury. He could support a household, maintain horses and weapons, host guests, and generally live in the style expected of nobility. He had successfully made the transition from exiled child to established Hungarian nobleman. With lands and a castle, Edward would have taken on new responsibilities and adopted new patterns of life. He would have spent time at court when the king required his presence, participating in councils and ceremonies. But he would also have spent time on his own estates, overseeing their management and administration. Medieval estate management was complex work. Edward would have had to ensure his lands were farmed efficiently, that rents and taxes were collected, that justice was dispensed fairly to maintain order. He would have had to manage relationships with neighboring landholders, forming alliances, resolving disputes, occasionally defending his boundaries if conflicts arose. He would have been responsible for maintaining military forces, ensuring that when the king called for warriors, Edward could supply his quota of armed men. His castle, whether it was the Reka castle mentioned in tradition or another fortress, would have been both his home and his military stronghold. Medieval castles were not the elaborate stone fortresses of later centuries. In the mid-11th century, most Hungarian castles were still wooden structures built on earthen mounds, with palisades and ditches for defence. But even these simpler fortifications required maintenance and garrisons. Edward would have employed a small army of people to maintain his estates and household. There would have been stewards who managed financial affairs, bailiffs who supervised agricultural work, household servants who cooked, cleaned, and maintained his residence. There would have been stable hands for his horses, smiths to maintain weapons and tools, possibly a chaplain to conduct religious services for his household. He would have participated in the social life of Hungarian nobility, attending feasts and celebrations, hosting his own gatherings, cementing friendships and alliances through gift-giving and hospitality. Medieval noble life was intensely social. Relationships were everything, and maintaining one's network of friends and allies required constant attention. All of this suggests that by his 30s, Edward had achieved something remarkable. He had survived an infancy in which he was condemned to death. He had grown up in exile, far from the kingdom that should have been his. But rather than becoming bitter or broken by these circumstances, he had built a good life. He had friends, property, status, and security. If the story ended here, we would have to count Edward among the fortunate, a man who had overcome terrible disadvantages to achieve prosperity and peace. But Edward's story was far from over. He was about to meet the woman who would become his wife, and together they would start a family that would, against all odds, reclaim a throne, though not for Edward himself. Sometime in the early 1040s, probably around 1043 or 1044, Edward took a wife. Her name was Agatha, and like so much else about Edward's life, and the details of who she was and where she came from have sparked historical debates that continue to this day. The identity of Edward's wife Agatha has puzzled historians for centuries. Medieval sources give us contradictory information, and modern historians have proposed numerous theories, none of them proven beyond doubt. This uncertainty is frustrating, but it's also a reminder of how much about the past remains mysterious, how many details have been lost to time. One early theory, popular in some medieval sources, held that Agatha was a daughter of King Stephen I of Hungary himself. This would have made her a Hungarian princess, and her marriage to Edward would have represented a significant honour, a union between the exiled English prince and the daughter of the king, who had sheltered him, and such a marriage would have cemented Edward's place in Hungarian society and created a permanent bond between his family and the Hungarian royal house. However, this theory faces significant chronological problems. King Stephen died in 1038, and most sources agree that Edward married Agatha around 1043 to 1044. If Agatha was Stephen's daughter, she would have to have been quite young at the time of her marriage, possibly still a child by modern standards, though medieval nobles often married young. More problematically, no contemporary source actually names Agatha as Stephen's daughter during his lifetime, which would be unusual if she were a legitimate princess. Another theory, supported by some German chronicles, suggests that Agatha was related to the Holy Roman Empire's royal family. Specifically, as she might have been the daughter of Ludolf, Margrave of West Friesland, who was a relative of Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. This connection would make sense politically. Henry III was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and a marriage connecting Edward to the imperial family would have been prestigious and diplomatically valuable. Some historians have suggested that Agatha might have been a Kievan princess, possibly a daughter of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Yaroslav was known for using marriage alliances to build diplomatic connections throughout Europe. His daughters married the kings of France, Norway, and Hungary. If Agatha was Yaroslav's daughter, it might explain how Edward came to marry her, perhaps meeting her through connections formed when the English princes passed through Kiev on their journey to Hungary. Yet another theory proposes that Agatha was related to the Bulgarian royal family, possibly descended from the last independent Bulgarian Tsars before Bulgaria was conquered by Byzantium. This would make her a princess in exile herself, sharing Edward's status as a displaced noble. The truth is that we simply don't know who Agatha was. Each theory has some evidence to support it, but none is conclusive. What we can say with certainty is that Agatha was a woman of noble birth. Her marriage to a prince, even an exiled one, would not have been acceptable if she had been of common origin. She was probably connected to one of the major royal or noble houses of Eastern Europe, and she was a woman whose life would be profoundly shaped by her marriage to Edward. Joining his journey from comfortable exile in Hungary to sudden death in England, regardless of who Agatha's parents were, her marriage to Edward would have followed the customs and rituals of 11th century Christian nobility. Medieval marriages among nobles were not primarily romantic unions based on love, though affection might develop, but political and economic alliances between families. They were contracts that united lineages, pooled resources, and created networks of mutual obligation and support. The marriage would have been negotiated by Edward and Agatha's families or guardians, with careful attention paid to what each party brought to the union. Edward could offer his royal blood. He was descended from one of Europe's most prestigious dynasties, even if that dynasty had lost its throne. He had estates in Hungary, military reputation from his service in Andrew's campaign, and the potential, however remote, of someday reclaiming his English inheritance. Agatha's family, whoever they were, would have brought their own advantages, noble connections, possibly lands or wealth, and, if she was indeed related to royalty, the prestige of their bloodline. The marriage negotiations would have established what properties and rights each party retained, what happened to the marriage portion, dowry, if one spouse died, and other practical matters. The wedding itself would have been a religious ceremony, conducted by a priest or bishop in a church. Medieval Christian weddings were solemn occasions focused on the sacramental nature of marriage, the joining of two people in a union blessed by God and intended to last until death. Edward and Agatha would have exchanged vows before witnesses and promising to honor and cherish each other. They would have received the church's blessing and participated in a mass celebrating their union. After the religious ceremony, there would have been festivities. Medieval noble weddings were occasions for feasting, music, dancing, and celebration. Edward would have hosted his noble friends and allies, cementing social bonds and displaying his wealth and status. The celebrations might have lasted several days, with guests staying at Edward's estates, enjoying his hospitality, and witnessing the union that would create a new family. After the wedding, Edward and Agatha would have established their household together. In medieval noble society, the household was the basic unit of economic and social organization. It included not just the married couple, but also their children, servants, retainers, and anyone else under their protection and authority. Agatha would have taken charge of managing the household's daily operations. This was no small responsibility. A noble household was like a small community, with dozens or even hundreds of people depending on it for their livelihood. Agatha would have overseen the servants, ensured that food stores were properly managed, supervised the preparation of meals, managed the household budget, and handled countless other administrative details. She would have been responsible for the household's textile production, a major economic activity in the medieval world. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were constant activities, producing the cloth needed for clothing, bedding, and other household needs. Agatha would have supervised women servants and possibly done some of this work herself, as even noblewomen were expected to be skilled with needle and thread. As a noblewoman, Agatha would also have had religious duties. She would have been expected to be pious, to pray regularly, to attend Mass, to give alms to the poor, and to generally serve as a moral exemplar for her household. She might have supervised a private chapel if Edward's estates were wealthy enough to maintain one, or she would have ensured the household regularly attended services at a nearby church. Edward, meanwhile, would have continued his responsibilities as a landholder and warrior. He would have been called to court regularly to attend King Andrew I and participate in royal councils. He would have been expected to provide military service when the king needed troops. He would have administered justice on his estates and settling disputes among his tenants and maintaining order. And he would have continued cultivating his network of friends and allies among the Hungarian nobility. But increasingly, as the years passed, Edward and Agatha's attention would have focused on the most important product of their marriage, children. In either 1045 or 1046, the sources disagree on the exact year, Agatha gave birth to their first child, a daughter. They named her Margaret, possibly after Saint Margaret of Antioch, a popular Christian martyr whose feast day was celebrated on July 20th. The choice of a saint's name was typical for medieval Christian families, reflecting their faith and their hopes that the saint would watch over and protect their child. The birth of a daughter was a moment of joy, but also perhaps of slight disappointment. Medieval nobles wanted sons to inherit their lands and titles, to carry on the family name, and to provide military service. Daughters were valuable too. They could be married off to create alliances, but they weren't what fathers dreamed of when imagining their legacy. Still, Margaret was the firstborn of Edward and Agatha's marriage, and she would have been welcomed and cherished. As an infant, she would have been cared for primarily by women, possibly a wet nurse who fed her, definitely attendants who changed her, bathed her, and watched over her. Agatha would have supervised this care closely, as noble mothers were expected to be involved in their children's upbringing, even if they weren't handling every practical detail themselves. As Margaret grew from infant to toddler to child, she would have been raised in the mixed cultural environment of Edward's household. She would have learned Hungarian as her first language, speaking it with servants and playing with other children at court or on the estates. But she would also have been taught about her English heritage, told stories about her father's royal ancestors, about Alfred the Great and Edmund Ironside, about the distant kingdom across the sea that should have been her father's inheritance. She would have been given an education appropriate for a noble girl. This meant learning the practical skills of household management that she would need as a wife and mother: spinning, weaving, sewing, managing servants, overseeing food preparation and storage. She would also have been taught to read, probably in Latin, so she could read scriptures and prayer books, and as she would have been instructed in Christian doctrine and morality, learning to be pious and virtuous. Most importantly for her future, Margaret would have been raised in a deeply religious environment. Edward and Agatha, like most medieval nobles, would have emphasized religious devotion as central to proper living. They would have prayed together as a family, attended Mass regularly, observed religious feast days and fasts, and generally structured their lives around the rhythms of the Christian year. This religious upbringing would profoundly shape Margaret's character and ultimately lead to her canonization as a saint. Around 1050, Agatha gave birth to a second child, another daughter, named Christina. Once again, Edward and Agatha had a girl rather than the son they likely hoped for. Medieval parents generally didn't choose their children's sexes. They accepted whatever God gave them. But there must have been some concern that Edward's line might die out if no son was born. Christina would have been raised much like her older sister, learning the same skills and receiving similar education. The two girls would have been companions in childhood, playing together, studying together, sharing the unique experience of being English princesses growing up in Hungarian society. We know less about Christina's personality and character than about Margaret's, as Christina's life was less dramatic and less well documented. But we do know that she would eventually become a nun, dedicating her life to God and the Church. And this religious vocation suggests that she was raised with strong Christian values and developed a deep personal faith. Having two daughters was good, but Edward needed a son. In medieval noble society, daughters were valuable for forming marriage alliances, but sons were essential for continuing the family name and inheritance. Without a son, Edward's estates would eventually pass to whoever married his daughters, and his bloodline, while continuing through his daughter's children, would lose the family name and direct inheritance. The pressure to produce a male heir was intense in medieval marriages. Kings had divorced wives, or had marriages annulled, when no sons were produced. While Edward, as an exiled prince, didn't have quite that much at stake, he certainly understood that his family's future depended on having a son to carry on his father's line. Sometime between 1051 and 1056, the exact date is uncertain, but most historians favor 1051 or 1052. Agatha finally gave birth to a son. They named him Edgar, a good English name that connected him to his heritage. Edgar had been the name of Edward's great-great-grandfather, King Edgar the Peaceful, who had ruled England in the 10th century, and whose reign was remembered as a time of prosperity and order. The birth of a son must have been an occasion of tremendous joy and relief for Edward and Agatha. They finally had a male heir, a boy who could inherit Edward's estates, who could carry on the family name, who could potentially reclaim the English throne if circumstances ever made that possible. Edgar represented hope for the future, while the continuation of a bloodline that had survived against all odds. As Edgar grew from infant to toddler to young boy, he would have begun receiving the education appropriate for a prince and future warrior. Even at age 4 or 5, he would have started learning to ride horses. By age 6 or 7, he would have begun training with toy weapons, developing the strength and coordination he would need for real combat when he was older. Edward would have been closely involved in his son's upbringing, teaching him about their family history, about the kingdom they had lost, about the duties and responsibilities of kingship. He would have told Edgar stories about Edmund Ironside, about how Edgar's grandfather had fought bravely against overwhelming odds, and about how the House of Wessex had ruled England for centuries and might rule again someday. Edgar would have learned to speak Hungarian fluently, as his sisters had, but he would also have been taught English. Edward, despite spending 40 years in Hungary, would have retained his knowledge of English, and he would have made sure his son could speak the language of their ancestors. They would have practiced together, Edward correcting Edgar's pronunciation, teaching him English words for common objects and actions, ensuring that if Edgar ever went to England, he would be able to communicate with his supposed subjects. By the early 1050s, Edward had achieved a kind of domestic peace that must have seemed unlikely during his turbulent early life. He had a wife he had lived with for nearly a decade, 3 healthy children, the estates that provided income and security, a position of respect among Hungarian nobility, and friendships and alliances that gave him influence and protection. The family would have spent their time between Edward's estates and the royal court, depending on the season and on what duties Edward owed to King Andrew. When at their estates, they would have lived in relative comfort, managing their lands, hosting visitors, and enjoying the pleasures of rural noble life, hunting, feasting, religious observances. When called to court, they would have participated in the more formal ceremonial aspects of noble life. Edward would have attended councils, given advice when asked, and fulfilled his obligations to the king. Agatha and the children might have come with him, or they might have stayed at the estates, depending on the circumstances and the length of Edward's absence. The children would have played together, explored the countryside around their homes, learned from tutors and from their parents. Margaret and Christina would have worked on their needlework and other domestic skills. Edgar would have practiced with his toy weapons and ridden his pony. They would have attended religious services, learned their prayers, and been instructed in Christian morality. It was a good life, perhaps not the life of English royalty that Edward's birth should have guaranteed him, but a comfortable, peaceful, prosperous existence nonetheless. Edward had every reason to believe he would spend the rest of his days in Hungary, watching his children grow up, eventually seeing them married to suitable spouses, and perhaps bouncing grandchildren on his knee in his old age, and finally being buried in Hungarian soil after a long and reasonably happy life. But in the early 1050s, news began reaching Hungary from England. News that would change everything. News that would ultimately lead Edward back to the land of his birth and to his tragic death. To understand why Edward was suddenly summoned back to England in the 1050s after 40 years of exile, we must turn our attention back to events in the kingdom he had left as an infant and had never seen since. After Cnut the Great's death in 1035, his empire had fragmented. His sons fought over the inheritance. England descended into political chaos, and eventually, in 1042, the English had restored the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty by crowning Edward, son of Ethelred the Unready, and Emma of Normandy, as king. And this Edward, known to history as Edward the Confessor because of his reputation for piety, was Edward the Exile's uncle, being the half-brother of Edmund Ironside through their shared father Ethelred. But the two Edwards had never met. The Confessor had been living in Normandy when his half-brother Edmund was fighting Cnut, and he had remained in Norman exile throughout the Danish occupation of England. By the time he became king in 1042, Edward the Exile had been in Hungary for more than 20 years. Edward the Confessor was a complex figure. His years in Norman exile had shaped him profoundly. He spoke French as fluently as English. He had absorbed Norman culture and customs, and he had formed close friendships with Norman nobles. When he became King of England, he brought many of these Norman friends with him, and giving them positions of power and influence in England. This favoritism toward foreigners created resentment among the Anglo-Saxon nobility, who felt they were being displaced in their own kingdom. The most powerful family in England during Edward the Confessor's reign was not the king's own relatives, but the Godwinsons, led by Earl Godwin of Wessex. Godwin had been prominent during Cnut's reign, and he had manoeuvred successfully to maintain his power after the restoration of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty. He had even managed to marry his daughter Edith to King Edward, making himself the king's father-in-law and giving him enormous influence over royal policy. But the relationship between Edward and the Godwinsons was difficult and sometimes hostile. The king resented Godwin's power and his presumption, and while Godwin and his sons, particularly Harold Godwinson, who would later become king himself, were frustrated by Edward's preference for Norman favourites over English nobles. The two sides engaged in a complex dance of alliance and rivalry, cooperation and conflict that would dominate English politics for decades. One of the major points of tension was the succession. Edward the Confessor and Queen Edith had no children, and as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that they would have no children. Whether this was due to Edward's alleged vow of celibacy, which earned him his epithet the Confessor, to physical inability on his or Edith's part, or to a simple refusal to consummate their marriage due to Edward's resentment of the Godwinson family, the result was the same. England would need a new king when Edward died, and there was no obvious heir. By the early 1050s, when Edward the Confessor was probably in his late 40s or early 50s, the succession question had become urgent. Various candidates had claims or ambitions to the throne. William, Duke of Normandy, was the king's cousin through Emma of Normandy, and Edward had spent his formative years in Normandy under William's father's protection. There are claims in Norman sources that Edward promised the throne to William, though English sources dispute this. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, after his father's death, was the most powerful man in England after the king. He had led English armies, administered vast territories, and had the loyalty of much of the English nobility. He had no direct blood claim to the throne, but he was positioned to seize power when Edward died. A Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, had his own claims based on agreements made during the Danish occupation of England. Though these claims were weak and would require military conquest to enforce, among all these powerful, ambitious men, there was also a more legitimate claimant, though he was far away and had been forgotten by most people in England. Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside, grandson of Ethelred, representative of the ancient House of Wessex that had ruled England for centuries. Compared to the other claimants, Edward the Exile had the best hereditary claim. He was Edmund Ironside's son, descended in direct male line from Alfred the Great. By the rules of inheritance that governed medieval succession, he should have been first in line for the throne after Edward the Confessor himself. But he had been gone from England for 40 years. He had built a life in Hungary. He had estates, a family, a position in Hungarian society. He probably spoke Hungarian better than English at this point. Most people in England didn't even know he was alive. How could such a man realistically become King of England? Sometime around 1054, Edward the Confessor and his advisors made a momentous decision. They would locate Edward the Exile and bring him back to England to be designated as heir to the throne. This decision solved several problems at once. Edward the Exile's hereditary claim was unquestionable. No one could argue that the son of Edmund Ironside wasn't entitled to inherit. His return would satisfy English nobles who wanted an Anglo-Saxon king rather than a Norman or Scandinavian one. And his long absence from England meant he had no existing power base, no faction owing him loyalty, no network of allies and enemies He would be dependent on King Edward's goodwill and guidance, making him controllable in a way that Harold Godwinson or William of Normandy could never be. From the perspective of Edward the Confessor and his advisors, it was an elegant solution. They would secure the succession with a legitimate heir, while avoiding empowering any of the dangerous, ambitious men who currently threatened the stability of the realm. In 1054, an embassy was prepared and dispatched to the continent. Its leader was Bishop Ealdred of Worcester, later Archbishop of York, one of Edward the Confessor's most trusted advisors and a skilled diplomat. Ealdred was given a difficult mission: locate Edward the Exile, convince him to return to England and negotiate with whatever foreign rulers might be sheltering him to allow his departure. Bishop Ealdred's journey took him first to Germany, to the court of Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. This makes sense for several reasons. First, the emperor was the most powerful ruler in Europe, and any diplomatic mission to Eastern Europe would benefit from his support, or at least his permission. Second, if Edward the Exile was in Hungary, Henry III had political influence there. Hungary was within the empire's sphere of influence, and Hungarian kings generally sought good relations with the emperor. Third, Ealdred needed information. He had to discover where exactly Edward was living and how to contact him. The bishop spent considerable time at the imperial court, probably months. A medieval diplomacy moved slowly. Messages had to be carried by couriers who travelled on horseback over bad roads, and responses had to be awaited. Every negotiation, every request, every piece of information exchange took time. But despite Ealdred's efforts and his diplomatic skills, the first embassy failed. The chronicles tell us that he was not at first successful in his mission. We don't know exactly why the embassy failed. Perhaps there were communication difficulties between the imperial court and Hungary. Perhaps King Andrew of Hungary was reluctant to let Edward go. After all, Edward had fought for Andrew, had estates in Hungary, and represented an asset to the Hungarian kingdom. Perhaps Edward himself was hesitant, uncertain about abandoning his comfortable life in Hungary for the uncertainties of English politics. Or perhaps the negotiations simply moved too slowly, and Bishop Ealdred had to return to England before completing his mission, due to time constraints or other duties calling him home. Whatever the reason, Ealdred returned to England in 1054 or 1055 without Edward the Exile. The mission had failed, but King Edward was not deterred. The succession problem hadn't gone away, and Edward the Exile remained the best solution. Another embassy would have to be sent. In 1056, a second diplomatic mission set out from England, and this time its leadership was even more prestigious. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, and the most powerful nobleman in England after the king himself, travelled to the continent, and one of his stops was probably Hungary. Harold's involvement in this mission is both interesting and somewhat ironic given later events. Harold himself had ambitions to the throne. 9 years later, he would seize the crown immediately after Edward the Confessor's death. Why would he work to bring back a potential rival? Several explanations are possible. In 1056, Harold might not yet have decided to pursue the throne himself. The king was still alive and relatively healthy, and Harold might have been focused on maintaining his family's power rather than personally becoming king. Alternatively, Harold might have calculated that having Edward the Exile as king would actually serve Godwinson's interests better than the alternatives. Edward the Exile would be weak, dependent, with no English power base. He would need the support of powerful nobles like Harold. By comparison, a William of Normandy or some other foreign prince would bring their own supporters and would be much harder for Harold to control or influence. Or perhaps Harold was simply following his king's orders, recognizing that refusing would anger Edward the Confessor, and undermine Harold's position at court. Medieval politics often required nobles to work against their own long-term interests in order to maintain their immediate standing with the king. Harold travelled to Flanders first, possibly meeting with the Count of Flanders to seek support or assistance. He may then have travelled on to Germany and ultimately to Hungary, though the sources are not entirely clear about his exact itinerary. What we do know is that by 1057, the negotiations had finally succeeded. After 3 years of diplomatic effort, Edward the Exile had agreed to return to England. The news of these English embassies must have reached Edward gradually, probably through intermediaries at first. Perhaps King Andrew received messages from the Holy Roman Emperor about English envoys seeking one of his nobles. Perhaps Edward heard rumours from travellers that England's king was searching for him. Eventually, official messages must have arrived, explaining that he was being summoned home to be designated as heir to the English throne. How did Edward react to this news? After 40 years in Hungary, the land of his birth must have seemed unreal, a story from another life rather than an actual place. He had spent his entire adult life building a position in Hungarian society. He had a wife, children, estates, friends, a comfortable life. Why would he give all of that up to venture into English politics, a realm of danger and uncertainty? But the pull must have been powerful. He was being offered the chance to become a king, to reclaim the throne his father had briefly held, to restore his family to power in the kingdom they had lost. This was the destiny his entire childhood had been preparation for, the goal that justified all the years of exile and struggle. How could he refuse? There would have been long discussions with Agatha about what to do. She would have had to leave her homeland too. Whether she was Hungarian, German, or Kievan, she would be abandoning her family and everything familiar to travel to England. The children would have to uproot their lives, leave behind friends and everything they knew, and travel to a land none of them had ever seen. And there would have been practical considerations too. What would happen to Edward's estates in Hungary? Would he have to sell them or forfeit them? Or could he maintain them even while living in England, perhaps leaving stewards to manage them? What about his obligations to King Andrew? Could he simply leave, or would he need the king's permission? Would Andrew be angry at losing a trusted nobleman, or pleased that one of his nobles might become King of England, creating a potential ally? All of these questions had to be resolved, and we can only imagine the discussions, negotiations, and emotional struggles that took place in Edward's household as the family debated what to do. In the end, Edward made the decision that would prove fatal. He agreed to return to England, and perhaps he felt he had no choice. Refusing a summons from the king might anger Edward the Confessor and create problems even in Hungary. Perhaps ambition won out over caution, and the chance to be a king proved too tempting to resist. Perhaps he genuinely believed it was his duty to return, that he owed it to his father's memory and his family's honour to reclaim their rightful place. Whatever his reasons, by 1057 the decision was made. Edward would leave Hungary, taking his wife and children with him, and make the long journey to England. He would finally see the kingdom he had been exiled from as an infant. He would meet his uncle the king. He would take up his position as heir to the throne. He would, if all went well, eventually become King of England himself, restoring the House of Wessex to the throne and vindicating his father's brave but failed resistance to Cnut. It must have seemed like destiny calling him home, like the culmination of his life's journey. After 40 years of exile, he was finally going to reclaim what should have been his all along. He could not have imagined that he was travelling to his death, or that he would die without even meeting the uncle who had summoned him home. He could not have known that his return to England, far from being a triumphant homecoming, would be one of the briefest and most tragic episodes in English royal history. But none of that was clear as Edward prepared for the journey, as he said goodbye to friends and allies in Hungary, as he made arrangements for his estates and settled his affairs. All he knew was that he was going home at last, and that everything he had waited for, everything he had been promised since childhood, was finally within reach. The journey to England began, and with it, the final chapter of Edward the Exile's life. The journey from Hungary to England in 1057 was no simple undertaking. It meant crossing the breadth of Europe, travelling through multiple kingdoms and territories, navigating rivers and mountain passes, and dealing with the constant dangers that beset medieval travellers: bandits, disease, bad weather, and the simple hazards of roads that were often little more than muddy tracks. Before Edward and his family could set out, there would have been weeks or even months of preparation. Medieval travel required extensive planning, especially when moving an entire noble household, including women and children, across international borders. Edward would have needed to settle his affairs in Hungary. His estates and properties couldn't simply be abandoned. Arrangements had to be made for their management in his absence. He might have appointed stewards to oversee his lands, collecting rents and maintaining order, until he could determine whether he would return or whether the properties should be sold or given away. He would have needed King Andrew's permission to leave Hungary, and this might have required delicate negotiations to ensure the king didn't feel abandoned or betrayed. His household would have needed organising. Which servants would accompany the family to England? Which would remain behind? Agatha would have needed to pack belongings for the journey and for their new life in England: clothing, personal items, and possibly treasured possessions that connected them to their Hungarian life. The children would have needed preparing emotionally for the dramatic change that was about to overturn their entire world. Financial arrangements would have been crucial. The journey would be expensive, requiring funds for accommodation, food, transportation, and passage through various territories. Edward would have needed to convert some of his assets into portable wealth: gold, silver, jewels that could be carried and used anywhere. He would also have needed letters of introduction and safe conduct from King Andrew, and possibly from the Holy Roman Emperor, documents that would smooth their passage through German lands and other territories. There would have been farewells to friends and allies, final visits to favourite places, a last looks at the Hungarian landscapes that had been home for 40 years. Edward was leaving behind everything familiar, and there must have been moments of doubt and regret, even as he prepared for what should have been his triumphant return. The exact route Edward took from Hungary to England is not recorded in detail, but we can reconstruct probable paths based on medieval travel patterns and the geography of 11th century Europe. The journey likely began with travel through Hungary itself, heading westward toward the borders with the German territories of the Holy Roman Empire. They might have followed the Danube River for part of this journey. The Danube was one of Europe's great highways, and travelling along rivers was often easier and safer than overland routes. Our river travel also offered opportunities to transport heavy baggage by boat, rather than having to carry everything on pack animals. From Hungary, they would have entered German territory, probably passing through Bavaria. If Agatha was indeed related to German nobility, this portion of the journey might have included stops at relatives' courts, where the family could rest, resupply, and gather news before continuing westward. If they travelled through Bavaria, they might have seen the great German cities that were centres of trade and learning, perhaps stopped at monasteries that offered hospitality to travellers, and experienced the different culture and customs of the Germanic lands. The journey would have taken them through the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. They might have travelled through Swabia and through the lands along the Rhine River, seeing the castles and fortifications that dotted the German landscape. They would have passed through territories ruled by various dukes, counts, and bishops. each with their own customs and requirements for travellers. Eventually, they would have reached the western borders of the empire, perhaps passing through Lorraine and into the Kingdom of France, or directly into Flanders. Both routes were possible depending on the exact path chosen and the political situation at the time. If they travelled through Flanders, the region roughly corresponding to modern Belgium and parts of northern France, they would have passed through some of the most economically advanced territories in Europe. Flemish cities like Bruges and Ghent were centres of cloth production and trade, wealthy and sophisticated. The Count of Flanders was one of Europe's more powerful nobles, and his territories were generally well governed and relatively safe for travellers. From Flanders, the final leg of the journey would have taken them to the English Channel. They would have needed to arrange passage across the Channel, finding ships willing to transport passengers, negotiating prices, waiting for favourable weather. The Channel crossing, though relatively short compared to the overland journey they had already completed, was potentially dangerous. Medieval ships were small and vulnerable to storms, and channel crossings sometimes ended in shipwreck and drowning. But assuming favourable weather and a successful crossing, Edward and his family would finally reach England, landing at one of the southern ports, perhaps Dover, perhaps Southampton, perhaps one of the smaller harbours along the coast. After weeks or months of travel, after crossing the breadth of Europe, they would finally set foot on the land that Edward had left as an infant, and that his wife and children had never seen at all. What would the journey have been like for Edward and his family? Medieval travel was slow, uncomfortable, and often dangerous, especially when travelling with women and children. They would have travelled primarily on horseback, though Agatha and possibly the children might have ridden in a wagon or litter for part of the journey, to spare them the physical demands of riding all day. Travel speeds varied depending on weather, road conditions, and the terrain, but a good day's travel might cover 20 to 30 miles, and this meant the journey from Hungary to England would have taken weeks at minimum, possibly several months if they made extended stops along the way. Each day would have followed a similar pattern. They would rise early, before dawn if possible, to take advantage of daylight hours. After prayers and a simple breakfast, they would mount up and begin the day's travel. The roads, often little more than dirt tracks, would be muddy in wet weather, dusty in dry weather, sometimes dangerous where they passed through forests where bandits might lurk. They would have travelled with guards and servants, a small caravan of people and pack animals carrying their belongings. Edward would have been armed, both for protection and because no nobleman travelled unarmed. The guards would have been alert for threats, bandits, hostile locals, wild animals, and progress would have been steady but slow. Horses couldn't be pushed too hard day after day, or they would break down. The pace had to be set by the slowest members of the group, probably Agatha and the children, who couldn't endure the same hardships as experienced male riders. They would have stopped periodically at towns, monasteries, or noble estates for rest and resupply. In towns, they might have stayed at inns, though medieval inns were often crowded, dirty, and uncomfortable places where guests slept in communal rooms and sanitation was minimal. At monasteries, they would have been offered hospitality as travelling nobility. Monasteries had a religious obligation to provide food and shelter to travellers, and hosting a prince and his family would have been considered an honour. At noble estates, if Edward had letters of introduction or personal connections, they might have been welcomed as guests, enjoying more comfortable accommodations and the chance to rest for a few days before continuing their journey. These stops would have been opportunities to learn news, to hear about conditions further along their route, and to build or reinforce social connections that might prove useful. The children would have found the journey alternately exciting and exhausting. Margaret was probably about 11 or 12 years old, Christina perhaps 7, and young Edgar only about 5 or 6. For them, everything would have been new and strange. The landscapes, the languages, the people they met. They were leaving behind everything familiar and travelling toward an unknown destination. And Agatha would have had to manage the practical details of keeping the family fed, clothed, and sheltered, while constantly on the move. Medieval women of noble birth were expected to be capable and resourceful, and Agatha would have needed all her skills to ensure the family's comfort and safety during such an extended journey. Edward himself would have been alert to both opportunities and dangers. He was travelling as an exiled prince about to reclaim his birthright, but until he actually reached England and was formally recognised by King Edward, he remained vulnerable. He needed to maintain his dignity and status, while also being careful not to offend the various rulers whose territories they passed through. Every interaction, every negotiation for accommodation or supplies, every meeting with local nobles or officials required diplomatic skill and careful judgment. After weeks of overland travel, the family would have reached the coast and prepared for the Channel crossing. This was a moment of transition. They were leaving the European mainland and heading toward England, toward Edward's destiny. The Channel crossing would have required finding a ship willing to take passengers. This might have meant waiting for days or even weeks for a suitable vessel and favourable weather. Medieval ships were small by modern standards, typically carrying only a few dozen people at most along with cargo. The crossing could take anywhere from a few hours to a full day or more, depending on winds and currents. The crossing itself would have been uncomfortable and potentially frightening, especially for those unused to sea travel. Medieval ships had no cabin accommodations for passengers. Everyone would have been on deck or in the hold, exposed to wind, spray, and the motion of the waves. Seasickness was common, and there was always the risk of storms or shipwreck. But eventually, if all went well, they would have sighted the English coast, the famous white cliffs of Dover perhaps, or the gentler shores of Sussex or Hampshire. Land, English land, the kingdom that was Edward's birthright and that he had never seen as an adult. As they approached the shore, what did Edward feel? Excitement, anxiety, relief that the long journey was nearly over, anticipation of finally meeting his uncle and taking up his position as heir, or perhaps a strange sense of unreality. After 40 years, England must have seemed more legend than reality, and suddenly it was before him, solid and real. The ship would have landed at one of the southern ports. Dover was the most common arrival point from the continent, with its great harbour and its castle overlooking the sea. Or perhaps they landed at Southampton, another major port. Wherever they arrived, local officials would have greeted them, verified their identities and the legitimacy of their journey, and made arrangements for them to continue toward London, or wherever King Edward was currently holding court. Word would have been sent ahead, announcing Edward the Exile's arrival. Messengers would have ridden toward the royal court, carrying the news. The lost prince had returned. The heir to the throne was in England. The son of Edmund Ironside had come home after 40 years in exile. At court, King Edward the Confessor would have received this news with satisfaction. His diplomatic gambit had succeeded. The succession problem was about to be solved. Edward the Exile would be brought to court, formally recognised as heir, introduced to the English nobility, and begin the process of becoming integrated into English politics and society. Or at least, that was the plan. What actually happened was very different. Edward and his family arrived in England in 1057, probably in late March or early April, based on the date of Edward's death. They had successfully completed the long journey from Hungary. They had crossed Europe, navigated the Channel, and reached England safely. Everything they had prepared for, Everything they had travelled so far to achieve, it was within reach. But Edward would never meet his uncle, King Edward the Confessor. He would never be formally designated as heir. He would never see London, never take up residence at court, never begin learning about the kingdom he was meant to rule. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other sources, Edward the Exile died within a few days of arriving in England. The exact timeline is uncertain. The sources say only that he died before he could meet the king. But given that his death is recorded as occurring on April 19th, 1057, and that he had recently arrived in England, we can infer that he probably arrived in late March or very early April, and died within days, or at most a couple of weeks. The location of his death is also uncertain. Some sources suggest he died in London, and others that he might have died at a location en route to wherever the king was holding court. What is clear is that whatever struck him down acted quickly. This was not a lingering illness, but something sudden and fatal. We can imagine the horror and confusion of those final days. Edward had survived so much, an infancy in which he was condemned to death, decades of exile, the journey across Europe. Now, with everything he had worked for within reach, he suddenly fell ill or was struck down. Perhaps he took to his bed with fever, his condition deteriorating rapidly despite the efforts of physicians. Perhaps he collapsed suddenly, without warning, his body giving out from some unknown cause. Agatha and the children would have been helpless, watching as Edward weakened and died. They were in a strange land, among people they didn't know, and the man who was supposed to guide them through this new world was dying. What could they do? Who could they turn to? King Edward the Confessor was informed of his nephew's illness, but apparently either couldn't or didn't come to visit him before the end. Whether this was due to practical difficulties, the king being too far away to reach Edward in time, or to deliberate avoidance is unclear, but the result was that uncle and nephew, who had never met despite being family, would never meet at all. On April 19th, 1057, Edward the Exile died. He was about 41 years old. He had been in England for perhaps 2 weeks at most, possibly less. He died without accomplishing any of the things he had returned to do, without securing his children's future, without seeing anything of the kingdom that should have been his. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's entry for that year captures the tragedy perfectly. Here came Edward Etheling to England, who was the son of King Edmund, who was called Ironside for his valour, and King Cnut sent him, while yet a child, out of the country to Hungary, to be there betrayed. And he had there grown to be a fine man, as God granted it to him, and he well deserved it, so that he had obtained the emperor's kinswoman for his wife, from whom he begat a fair progeny. Her name was Agatha. We do not know for what reason it was brought about, that he was not allowed to see his kinsman King Edward. Alas, that was a rueful time and injurious to all this nation, that he so quickly ended his life after he came to England, argued to the misfortune of this miserable people. That phrase, "We do not know for what reason it was brought about that he was not allowed to see his kinsman King Edward," has echoed through the centuries. The chronicler seems to be suggesting that there was something suspicious about Edward's death, that it was not simply bad luck, but something deliberate, something arranged. The carefully worded phrase, "it was brought about," implies agency, deliberate action. Someone, somewhere, made sure that Edward the Exile would not live to meet the king, would not live to be designated as heir, would not live to threaten the ambitions of other claimants to the throne. But who and how? And can we ever know the truth? The death of Edward the Exile has been debated by historians for nearly 1,000 years. Was it murder, natural causes, an accident? Each possibility has its advocates, and each has significant problems. Let us examine the evidence, such as it is. and consider the various explanations that have been proposed. The simplest explanation is often the best. Perhaps Edward simply died of natural causes, a victim of disease or some sudden medical crisis. Medieval people died suddenly all the time from causes that are easily treatable today. Edward had just completed an exhausting journey across Europe, weeks or months of travel, sleeping in unfamiliar places, eating unfamiliar food, exposed to different climates and different diseases. Medieval travellers were constantly at risk of illness. Perhaps Edward contracted dysentery from contaminated water. Perhaps he developed pneumonia after sleeping in damp conditions. Perhaps he had a heart attack or stroke. Both possible even for a man in his early 40s, especially one who had just endured significant physical stress. The journey from Hungary to England would have taken Edward through multiple disease environments. Every region had its own endemic diseases, and travellers were especially vulnerable because they lacked immunity to local pathogens, a disease that might be mild for local people who had been exposed to it since childhood, could be deadly for a newcomer. Consider also that Edward had spent 40 years in Hungary. His body would have been adapted to Hungarian climate, Hungarian food, Hungarian disease patterns. Suddenly being in England, with its damper climate, different diet, and different disease environment, might have overwhelmed his system, and culture shock and climate adjustment can have real physiological effects, weakening the immune system and making people more vulnerable to illness. Moreover, the timing of his death, shortly after arriving in England, is actually consistent with natural causes. Travel-related illnesses often manifest a few days to a week or two after exposure. If Edward picked up an infection during his journey, it might not have shown symptoms until shortly after his arrival in England. The problem with the natural causes theory is that it seems almost too convenient for Edward to survive 40 years of exile, to make the dangerous journey from Hungary to England successfully, and then to die within days of arriving, just when he was about to threaten the ambitions of multiple powerful men, seems like extraordinary bad luck. It's possible, certainly, but it raises suspicions. The alternative explanation, that Edward was murdered, has been suggested by historians since medieval times. The suspicious timing, the cryptic phrasing of the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, and the political context all point toward foul play. Consider who benefited from Edward's death. Several powerful men had strong motives to want him dead. Harold Godwinson was the most powerful nobleman in England and had clear ambitions to the throne. If Edward the Exile had lived and been designated as heir, Harold's path to kingship would have been blocked. Harold had spent considerable effort bringing Edward back to England, or so the sources claim, but this might have been a ruse to get Edward into a position where he could be eliminated. Bringing Edward to England and then murdering him would be more easily explainable than having him die mysteriously in Hungary or during the journey. Against this theory, Harold's involvement in the negotiations to bring Edward back seems genuine, and if he wanted Edward dead, it would have been simpler to arrange an accident during the long journey from Hungary, rather than waiting until Edward reached England. Moreover, Harold's power base was strong enough that he might not have felt particularly threatened by Edward's return. An exiled prince with no English connections could potentially be controlled or manipulated. William of Normandy also had ambitions to the English throne. Norman sources claim that Edward the Confessor had promised William the succession, though English sources dispute this. Edward the Exile's return and designation as heir would have destroyed William's claims. William had agents and allies in England who might have acted on his behalf. Against this theory, in 1057, William's claim to England was not yet urgent. King Edward the Confessor was still alive and could presumably reign for years. There was no immediate need to eliminate a potential rival. Moreover, having Norman agents operate so boldly in England, murdering a prince under the king's protection, would have been extremely risky and could have destroyed William's relationship with Edward the Confessor. King Edward the Confessor himself is a more disturbing possibility. Perhaps the king had second thoughts about making Edward the Exile his heir. Perhaps Edward the Exile said or did something during his brief time in England that offended the king or raised doubts about his suitability. Perhaps Edward the Confessor feared that Edward the Exile, once designated as heir, would become too powerful and might even try to seize the throne prematurely. Against this theory, the king had gone to considerable effort to bring Edward back. Changing his mind so quickly seems unlikely. Moreover, openly murdering his nephew would have been politically disastrous for Edward the Confessor, undermining his authority and turning English nobles against him. Other court factions might have had their own reasons for wanting Edward dead. Perhaps supporters of other succession candidates acted on their own initiative. Perhaps foreign powers with interests in England, Denmark for instance, which had ruled England in recent memory, had agents working to destabilize the succession. If Edward was murdered, how was it done? Medieval murderers had various options. Poison was the classic method for political murder. It could be administered in food or drink. It could be made to look like natural illness, and it was difficult to detect with medieval medical knowledge. Various poisonous plants and substances were known and could be obtained by those with the right connections. The problem with poison is that it requires access to the victim. Someone would have had to get close enough to Edward to contaminate his food or drink. This implies either a servant in Edward's household who was bribed or threatened, or someone at an establishment where Edward stayed who was paid to add poison to his meals. Violence was another possibility, though less likely given that it would be harder to cover up. A staged accident, a fall from a horse, a sudden assault by bandits, all were possible, but all would raise questions and suspicions. The sources don't mention any wounds or violent circumstances surrounding Edward's death, which makes this explanation less likely. Deliberate exposure to disease was theoretically possible. In an age before germ theory, people didn't understand how diseases spread, but they did know that sick people could make others sick. Could someone have deliberately exposed Edward to disease? It seems far-fetched, and the practical difficulties would have been substantial. The weight of suspicion. The most compelling evidence for murder is not any specific detail, but the overall pattern. The timing is suspicious. Edward dies within days of arriving in England, just as he's about to become heir to the throne. The circumstances are mysterious. The sources give us no clear cause of death, no details about his final illness. The phrasing in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle suggests the chronicler himself was suspicious. We do not know for what reason it was brought about that he was not allowed to see his kinsman King Edward. That phrase, "it was brought about," is crucial. It suggests agency, deliberate action. The chronicler seems to be hinting that Edward's death was not natural but orchestrated, even if he couldn't or wouldn't say so directly. Moreover, medieval people were not naive about political murder. They understood that powerful men eliminated rivals, that succession disputes led to violence, and that ambition could drive people to terrible acts. When Edward died so conveniently for those who would have been threatened by his accession, medieval observers would have immediately suspected foul play. But suspicion is not proof. We have no confession, no witness testimony, no physical evidence. We have only the suggestive timing, the cryptic chronicle entry, and the knowledge that several powerful men had strong motives for wanting Edward dead. The verdict of history. Modern historians are divided. Some believe Edward was murdered, pointing to the suspicious circumstances and the political context. Others believe he died of natural causes, arguing that the timing, while convenient for his enemies, was simply bad luck. Still others acknowledge that we will probably never know for certain what happened. What we can say is this: Edward the Exile died suddenly, mysteriously, and conveniently for those who would have been threatened by his succession. Whether this was murder or coincidence, the result was the same. The last adult male heir of the House of Wessex was dead, leaving only his young son Edgar, too young to be considered a viable king. The succession crisis that Edward's return was meant to solve remained unsolved, and England would slide toward the catastrophe of 1066. Edward was buried with honour in Old St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the great church that stood on the site where the current St. Paul stands today. His tomb was alongside those of other members of English royalty in the ancient cathedral that had witnessed so much of English history. His grandfather Ethelred was buried there, as were many others of his line. The old St. Paul's would burn in the Great Fire of London in 1666, and the current cathedral, built by Christopher Wren, would rise on its ruins. Edward's tomb was lost in the fire, and today no one knows exactly where his bones rest, but somewhere beneath or near the current St. Paul's, in earth that has been sacred ground for more than a millennium, lies all that remains of Edward the Exile, the prince who came home to die. Edward's death left his family in a terrifying situation. Agatha was now a widow in a foreign country, speaking little or no English, with 3 young children to protect, and no obvious protector or means of support. Her husband had been summoned to England to become heir to the throne, but he was dead, and his death had left the family vulnerable and isolated. What happened next speaks to both the mercy and the calculation of King Edward the Confessor. The king did not abandon his nephew's family. Whatever his feelings about Edward's death, whether he mourned genuinely or viewed it as a convenient resolution to a political problem, he recognized obligations to Edward's widow and children. Moreover, young Edgar was now the last surviving male heir of Edmund Ironside's line, which gave him significance regardless of his age. King Edward took the family under his protection, bringing them to court and ensuring they were provided for. This was both a kindness and a political necessity. Allowing Edward's family to be mistreated or to fall into poverty would have been shameful for the king, and would have angered those nobles who had supported Edward the Exile's return. Young Edgar, and probably only about 5 or 6 years old, was recognized as an Etheling, a prince of the royal blood who was eligible for kingship. This was his birthright, his identity, the thing that defined him in English noble society. But being an Etheling at age 5 or 6 meant very little in practical terms. He was far too young to rule, too young even to begin serious political involvement. He was a potential future king, but for now he was simply a child who needed care and education. Queen Edith, King Edward's wife and daughter of the late Earl Godwin, took a particular interest in young Edgar. She effectively adopted him, taking responsibility for his upbringing and education. This was a position of honour but also of vulnerability. Edgar was being raised by the wife of one king and the daughter of one of England's most powerful families, but he had no power base of his own, no family network to protect his interests, no independent source of support. Edith and Edward's court would become Edgar's home for the next 9 years, until King Edward's death in 1066. During that time, Edgar would be educated as a prince, learning the skills and knowledge he would need if he ever became king. He would learn to read and write in both English and Latin. He would study Christian theology and morality. He would learn about English law and governance. He would receive training in warfare and military leadership. But he would also learn the harsh realities of being a powerless prince in a court dominated by powerful families with their own agendas. The Godwinsons, Harold, Tostig, Gurth, Leofwine and their brothers, were the real power in England, Harold in particular, and as Earl of Wessex, commanded resources and loyalty that dwarfed anything Edgar could hope to access. Edgar would have understood from an early age that his theoretical right to the throne meant little without actual power to back it up. Edward's daughters, Margaret and Christina, faced different futures than their brother. As girls, they were not eligible for the throne and had no political significance based on their own bloodlines, but they were still noblewomen, still princesses of a royal house, and as such they needed to be educated appropriately and eventually either married or placed in religious houses. The most likely scenario, supported by various historical sources, is that the girls were sent to Wilton Abbey, one of the most prestigious religious houses in England, and Wilton was particularly associated with the royal family. Queen Edith herself had been educated there, and it was a place where noble girls received training in religion, household management, needlework, music, and other skills appropriate to their station. At Wilton, Margaret and Christina would have lived in a structured, ordered environment. Their days would have been organized around religious services, matins in the early morning, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, following the canonical hours that structured the monastic life. Between services, they would have worked on various tasks and studies. They would have learned to read Latin, enabling them to follow the prayers and scriptures used in services. They would have studied the lives of saints and the teachings of the Church Fathers. They would have practiced needlework and creating the intricate embroideries that adorned church vestments and hangings. They would have learned to sing the psalms and hymns that were central to religious worship. But they would also have received training in more practical matters. Even if they eventually took religious vows, they needed to understand household management, as many nuns held administrative positions in their religious houses, and if they married instead of becoming nuns, which was still possible despite their residence at Wilton, they would need all the skills required of a noble wife and household manager. For Margaret and Christina, Wilton was both a refuge and a prison. They were safe there, protected by the church and by the Abbey's royal connections, but they were also isolated from the wider world, their lives constrained by the Abbey's rules and routines. They had left their childhood home in Hungary, crossed Europe, lost their father, and now found themselves in an English nunnery, speaking a language they were still learning, following customs that were foreign to them. The most mysterious fate was that of Agatha herself. After her arrival in England and Edward's death, she effectively disappears from the historical record for nearly a decade. We have no chronicle entries mentioning her, no charters that she witnessed, no clear information about where she lived or what she did between 1057 and the Norman conquest in 1066. Several possibilities exist. She might have remained at court under King Edward's protection, living quietly in royal apartments or at one of the royal estates, withdrawn from public life in her grief and isolation. As she might have spent time at Wilton with her daughters or at some other religious house. She might have had her own modest household somewhere, maintained by funds provided by the king. What seems clear is that she had no independent power or influence. She was a foreign woman in a strange land, dependent entirely on the king's charity for her support. She could not return to Hungary. The long journey was too dangerous and expensive for a widow travelling alone or with minimal escort. She had no choice but to remain in England and hope that the king continued to protect her and her children. The isolation must have been crushing. She had left her homeland, whatever it was, to follow her husband to what should have been glory and power. Instead, she had watched him die within days of arriving, and leaving her stranded in a foreign country with no family support, no network of friends or allies, and 3 children whose futures were uncertain. Did she feel guilt for agreeing to leave Hungary? Did she blame herself for her husband's death? wondering if she should have argued more strongly against the return. Did she fear for her children's safety, knowing that they were vulnerable pawns in the dangerous game of English politics? Or did she find some measure of peace in her situation, perhaps seeking comfort in religion, and in the knowledge that at least her children were safe and cared for? We will never know. Agatha remains one of the more shadowy figures in this already shadow-filled story, a woman whose origins are uncertain, whose life is largely undocumented, and whose thoughts and feelings are completely lost to history. For 9 years after Edward the Exile's death, the situation remained stable if unresolved. King Edward the Confessor continued to rule, young Edgar continued to grow up at court, and the succession question remained officially unanswered. But on January 5th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died. He had been ill for some time, and his death was not unexpected, but it immediately triggered the succession crisis that everyone had feared, and that Edward the Exile's return had been meant to prevent. Edgar Atheling was now about 14 or 15 years old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to effectively claim the throne. He had the best hereditary claim of anyone in England. He was the grandson of Ethelred the Unready, the nephew of Edward the Confessor, the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Alfred the Great. His bloodline was impeccable, but bloodline alone was not enough. The Witan, the assembly of great nobles and churchmen who had a say in choosing the king, had to consider not just hereditary claims, but practical questions. Could the candidate actually rule? Could he defend the kingdom? Did he have the support needed to maintain order and resist challenges to his authority? For a few days, there was apparently serious discussion of making Edgar king. Some members of the Witan supported him, recognizing his superior claim by blood, but the consensus quickly formed that Edgar was too young, too inexperienced, too lacking in military capability and political connections. England faced immediate external threats. William of Normandy was preparing to invade to claim what he said was his promised throne, and Harald Hardrada of Norway was also making plans for invasion. England needed a mature, experienced warrior king who could lead armies and defend the realm. On January 6th, 1066, the day after King Edward's death, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. He had the support of most of the English nobility. He commanded powerful military forces, and he had years of experience leading armies and governing territories. From a practical standpoint, he was the obvious choice, but his accession meant that Edgar's chance, if he'd ever really had one, was gone. The throne that should have gone to Edward the Exile, that might have gone to young Edgar if Edward had lived long enough for Edgar to grow up under his father's guidance, had instead gone to the Godwinson family. What followed was one of the most famous years in English history. Harold Godwinson faced invasions from both Harald Hardrada, who landed in the north with a Norwegian army, and William of Normandy, who landed in the south with a Norman French army. Harold defeated Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in September 1066, but then had to immediately march south to face William. At Hastings on October 14th, 1066, William defeated and killed Harold, opening the way for Norman conquest of England. For Agatha and her children, the Norman conquest was a catastrophe. The new Norman regime viewed them with suspicion. They were members of the old Anglo-Saxon royal family and potential rallying points for English resistance, but they were also valuable hostages or pawns, people who might be useful for legitimizing Norman rule or for building alliances. In the chaos following Hastings, some English nobles briefly proclaimed Edgar Atheling as king. He was, after all, the last legitimate Anglo-Saxon claimant, but Edgar had no army, no resources, no realistic chance of defeating William's forces. The proclamation was more symbolic than practical, a gesture of defiance rather than a genuine attempt to resist Norman conquest. Edgar, along with his mother and sisters, submitted to William the Conqueror shortly after the conquest was complete. William initially treated them well, recognizing that being merciful to the surviving Anglo-Saxon royals would help win acceptance from the English people. The Edgar was kept at William's court, effectively as a prisoner, though treated with the honours due to his birth. But the situation was inherently unstable. Edgar was periodically involved in rebellions against Norman rule, sometimes willingly and sometimes simply because others used his name and claim without his permission. He fled to Scotland, returned to England, went into exile again, submitted again. His life became a depressing cycle of resistance, submission, exile and return, always powerless, always manipulated by others, never able to actually claim the throne that was rightfully his. He would live for decades, possibly into the 1120s, making him one of the longest-lived figures of his era. But he would never be king, never marry, never have children. He was always the Etheling, the prince who might have been, and the last Anglo-Saxon claimant to a throne that no longer existed. While Edgar's life settled into disappointed obscurity, his sister Margaret's took a very different and far more remarkable path. In 1067, she and her mother Agatha fled England with Edgar, seeking refuge in Scotland from the Norman conquest. Scotland was ruled by King Malcolm III, known as Malcolm Canmore. Malcolm had his own grievances against Norman rule. He had supported the Anglo-Saxon cause during the conquest and opposed William's expansion northward. He welcomed the English refugees, and he was particularly impressed by the beautiful, pious Margaret. In 1070, Malcolm married Margaret. She was about 24 or 25 years old, and he was probably in his late 30s, and their marriage was both political and personal. Malcolm gained a wife with royal Anglo-Saxon blood, strengthening his own legitimacy and his opposition to the Normans, while Margaret gained a protector and the elevated status of queenship. But Margaret was much more than just a queen consort. She became a force for religious reform in Scotland, working tirelessly to bring Scottish church practices into line with continental European standards. She founded churches and monasteries. She established schools. She reformed the Scottish court, introducing more sophisticated customs and practices. She gave alms generously to the poor and was renowned throughout Scotland for her charity and piety. Margaret and Malcolm had 8 children together, creating a large and influential family. Their children included several future kings of Scotland and a daughter, Matilda, also called Edith, who would marry King Henry I of England, William the Conqueror's son. In 1093, Margaret died at Edinburgh Castle, just days after learning that her husband Malcolm and her eldest son Edward had been killed in battle. She was about 47 years old. Her death followed a life of remarkable achievement. She had gone from exiled princess to queen, from refugee to saint. She was canonized by Pope Innocent IV in 1250. Christina, Margaret's younger sister, chose or was chosen for a different path. She became a nun, taking vows that dedicated her life to God and the Church. She eventually became a prioress at Romsey Abbey in Hampshire, a position of significant responsibility and authority within the religious community. Romsey Abbey was an important religious house, and as prioress, Christina would have been responsible for managing much of its daily operations, supervising other nuns, maintaining discipline, and ensuring that the abbey's lands and properties were properly administered. It was a life of service and devotion, but also one of relative power and independence within the constrained world available to medieval women. Christina lived a long life. She was still alive and serving as prioress well into the 12th century. Unlike her brother Edgar, who struggled for decades with his impossible position as the last Anglo-Saxon Etheling, and unlike her sister Margaret, who lived intensely and died relatively young, Christina found peace in religious life. She never married, never had children, never sought power or glory, but by all accounts, she lived a good and pious life, respected within her religious community, and remembered as a capable administrator and devout Christian. In its own way, her life was as successful as Margaret's, though far less dramatic. As we reach the end of our peaceful journey through Edward the Exile's life, let us reflect on the long shadow he cast over English history, not through what he did, but through what he failed to do, and through what his descendants achieved. The most immediate and obvious consequence of Edward's death was the succession crisis of 1066. If Edward had lived, if he had been designated as heir and had survived until King Edward the Confessor's death, the entire history of England might have been different. With Edward the Exile as king, England would have had a ruler with unquestionable Anglo-Saxon blood and legitimate hereditary claim. William of Normandy might still have tried to press his supposed claim, but he would have faced a legitimate king, rather than the more ambiguous situation that Harold Godwinson's accession created. Harold Hardrada's invasion might never have happened at all, as he might have recognized that an Edmund Ironside's son on the throne had better legitimacy than he could ever claim. More importantly, if Edward the Exile had been king for 9 years before 1066, his son Edgar would have been in a completely different position. Edgar would have been crown prince, trained by his father in kingship, building relationships with English nobles, developing his own power base. When Edward the Confessor died, and Edgar would have been 23 or 24 years old, rather than 14 or 15, old enough to be taken seriously as a warrior and leader. The Witan might well have accepted him as king, rather than turning to Harold Godwinson. And if Edgar had become king, there might have been no Norman conquest. The entire trajectory of English history, language, culture, law, society, would have been different. The Anglo-Saxon period might have continued, evolving naturally rather than being abruptly transformed by Norman conquest. All of this is speculation, of course. History is full of contingencies and unexpected turns, and we can never know with certainty what would have happened. But Edward the Exile's death clearly created the conditions that made the Norman conquest possible. His survival might have prevented one of the most significant events in English history, but if Edward the Exile failed to reclaim the throne himself, his bloodline did eventually triumph through his remarkable daughters. Margaret, as we have seen, became Queen of Scotland and later Saint Margaret. Her influence on Scottish history was profound, but her importance to English history is equally significant. Through her daughter Matilda's marriage to Henry I of England, the Anglo-Saxon royal bloodline was reintroduced into the English monarchy. Matilda was a fascinating figure in her own right. Born around 1080, she was raised at Romsey Abbey under her Aunt Christina's care. She was educated as a possible nun, but she resisted taking permanent vows, insisting that she wanted to remain free to marry. This resistance paid off when Henry I, a youngest son of William the Conqueror, chose her as his wife. Their marriage in 1100 was celebrated as a reconciliation between Norman and Saxon, between conqueror and conquered. Henry was thoroughly Norman, son of the man who had destroyed Anglo-Saxon England. Matilda, who took the English name Edith in honour of King Edward the Confessor's wife, was thoroughly English in blood, great-granddaughter of Edmund Ironside and descendant of Alfred the Great. Their children and descendants would rule England for centuries. Every subsequent English and British monarch has been descended from Matilda, and thus from Margaret, and thus from Edward the Exile. The House of Wessex did not die with the Norman conquest. It was absorbed into the new Norman dynasty, its blood mixing with that of the conquerors to create the medieval and modern English monarchy. This is perhaps the greatest irony of Edward the Exile's story. He came to England to reclaim the throne and died without achieving anything. His son Edgar lived in powerless obscurity for decades, the last Anglo-Saxon Etheling, unable to claim what was rightfully his. But through Margaret and her descendants, the Anglo-Saxon royal blood that Edward carried across Europe did ultimately return to the English throne. William the Conqueror's Norman dynasty ruled England, but William's descendants married Edward the Exile's descendants, and the bloodline that resulted combined both Norman and Anglo-Saxon heritage. Every English king and queen since Henry I, Plantagenets, Lancasters, Yorks, Tudors, Stuarts, Hanoverians, Saxe-Coburg-Gothas, Windsors, has carried the blood of Edward the Exile, of Edmund Ironside, of Alfred the Great. In this sense, Edward achieved a strange posthumous victory. His line did not die out. His descendants did reclaim royal status. The house he represented did survive and eventually merge with the new ruling dynasty. It took a century and happened through unexpected paths, but Edward the Exile's bloodline did return to power. Let us consider, as we prepare to drift off to sleep, the remarkable nature of Edward's life simply as a story of survival. He was born into a kingdom at war, in a year when his family lost everything. His father fought valiantly, but died mysteriously within weeks of becoming king. His infant self was condemned to death by the most powerful king in Northern Europe. He should have died as a baby, murdered on Cnut's orders, but he survived. A Swedish king refused to kill him. Rulers in Kiev or Hungary gave him shelter. He grew from condemned infant to exiled child to young man to established nobleman. He married, had children, built a life. Then, at age 40, he gave up that life to pursue what should have been his birthright. He travelled across Europe, crossed the Channel, and reached England, the kingdom he had left as an infant. Against all odds, he had come home. And then he died, suddenly and mysteriously, within days of arrival. After 40 years of exile, after crossing the breadth of Europe, after surviving everything that should have killed him, he died just as triumph seemed within reach. It is a story almost too dramatic to be believed if it weren't historically documented. It is a story of extraordinary survival followed by tragic, sudden death. It is a story of dreams deferred and then destroyed. It is a story of injustice and mystery and sorrow. But it is also, in its way, a story of triumph. Edward survived when he should have died. He built a good life when he should have been forgotten. He had children who did achieve greatness, even if he did not. His blood continues in kings and queens. His story, nearly forgotten for centuries, has been remembered and retold. Throughout this long night's journey through Edward's life, we have focused necessarily on the historical facts, the politics, the successes and failures. But let us remember, as sleep approaches, that Edward was a real person with thoughts and feelings that are lost to us. He would have laughed at jokes we cannot know. He would have loved people whose names are not recorded. And he would have had favourite foods, favourite places, favourite activities. He would have had fears and hopes, regrets and satisfactions, all the complex inner life that makes us human. We know he was brave. He fought in battles for Andrew of Hungary. We know he was responsible. He managed estates and supported a household. We know he was capable of deep loyalty. He maintained his English identity despite 40 years in Hungary. We know he was willing to take risks. He left security in Hungary to pursue an uncertain future in England. But what was he like as a person? Was he funny or serious? Quick to anger or patient? Devout or merely conventionally religious? Good with children or distant from them? affectionate with his wife, or formal. We will never know these things, and that is both frustrating and humanizing. And it reminds us that behind every historical figure is a complete human being whose inner life is mostly lost to time. Edward was not just the exile, not just a failed claimant to the throne, not just a tragic victim of politics. He was a man who lived 41 years, who experienced joy and sorrow, who had hopes and disappointments, who made choices both wise and foolish, who loved and was loved in return. And so our journey ends where Edward's life ended, in England, far from the land where he had built his life, among strangers who should have been his people, dying before he could achieve what he had come so far to claim. But let us not see his story as only tragic. Yes, he died young. Yes, he failed to become king. Yes, his death probably changed history in ways that harmed England. But he also survived against impossible odds. He built a life in exile that was prosperous and good. He married and had children who did achieve greatness. His bloodline continues to this day in the royal families of Europe. His story, though painful, is remembered and retold, keeping his memory alive nearly 1,000 years after his death. Edward the Exile rests somewhere beneath or near St. Paul's Cathedral in London, his exact burial place lost when the old cathedral burned in 1666. But his spirit, if such things exist, might find some satisfaction in knowing that he is remembered, that his story is told, that his descendants did ultimately reclaim the throne, and that every British monarch since the 12th century has carried his blood. As you drift off to sleep tonight, dear listener, let Edward's story remind you that lives are measured not just by what we achieve, but by how we face adversity, by how we survive impossible situations, by how we build meaning in difficult circumstances. Edward lost the kingdom that should have been his, but he lived with courage and dignity. He did his best with the life that chance and history gave him. May you sleep peacefully, as Edward now sleeps in his London grave. May his story carry you gently into dreams of medieval courts, of distant kingdoms, of the strange and winding paths that history takes. And may you wake refreshed, remembering that every life has value, every story deserves to be told, and that sometimes the greatest legacies are not the ones we intend, but the ones that unfold across generations in ways we could never imagine. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well under the gentle watch of history's quiet tales, and may Edward the Exile, the prince who came home to die, rest at last in the peace that eluded him in life.